This is Audible.
Dead Cells. Written by Adam Millard. Narrated by Luke Smith. "30 days. 30 more shitty, wasted days, and he was out of there for good. He hoped. There was very little chance that he would make the same mistake ever again, although most prisoners had the same dreams while lying in jail, only to emerge into the real world and end up criminals once again. Shane Bridge sighed, his mattress dirty and in need of replacement, although he had never seen a replacement issued in his 3 years frequenting cell 101, creaked beneath him. He wondered if Billy heard the creak. Billy Toombs, the man lying on the upper bunk of the bed in cell 101, had protected Shane throughout. Shane would have been nothing more than just another dead man in jail, if it hadn't been for the giant sleeping above him now. Trained in some weird martial art that Shane had never heard of before, Billy was half American Indian, half Irish. Fuck knows how that happened, and Shane didn't care in the slightest. But the man was a giant, and Shane had just been grateful that the ogre had not been a rapist or murderer. "You having a wank down there?" Billy asked, a little snigger following. "You'd like that, wouldn't you?" Shane said, smiling to himself. "If I were," he continued, "I know that you'd be peeking through that fucking mattress, checking if it was true what they say." "What do they say?" Billy asked, still sniggering. "They say," Shane smiled, "that white men, pure Americans like me, have the biggest penises on earth, and that half Tonto, half Patties like yourself have the smallest. And that even though you're great with a tomahawk and even better with a pint of Guinness, you're absolutely shit when it comes to handling your primary weapon." Shane laughed, and so did Billy. With a change of tone, one that indicated sincerity, Billy asked, "Is it her? Holly?" "Of course it is," Shane replied. "I haven't, been with her for so long. I just can't believe that I'm finally going home." There came a silence, and it wasn't unwelcome. Shane actually enjoyed the lack of questions. Billy had a way of pushing his questioning a little too far, and Shane always had an answer for him. "I wish I was you," Billy said, a sigh accompanying his statement. "Not because you're getting out in less than a month, but because you have people on the outside that love you more than possible." A slight pause. "I envy you, Shane Bridge. You're everything that I should have been." Shane, at that moment in time, felt a pang of guilt. Was he leaving his comrade? Was he a deserter? Billy had another 10 years to serve, if his appeal actually came to fruition, and Shane had his doubts. In how many ways was it possible to claim innocence when the axe was still bloody, in your grip, when the sheriff turned up to investigate a loud noise? There was no way, not a cat-in-hell's chance, that Billy Toombs had chopped up his wife's lover. There was more chance of ordering ice water from hell and having it hand-delivered by Lucifer himself. Incarceration, though, had been the most spiritual journey that Billy had ever been on. The man was a believer through and through, and he had kept Shane sane for almost 3 years. Shane had been one of the lucky ones. Others had been beaten to death in their own cells, raped for nothing more than a cigarette, tortured for information on who had put them inside. Life for Shane Bridge had been much better than most, and he was more than aware of his good fortune. "You on the court tomorrow?" Shane asked, changing the subject surreptitiously. "I think I need a little practice against someone as silly-looking as you." Billy laughed. "I'll be on the court. If it's a tussle you want, little Bridge, then you're gonna get it." Shane smiled and fell into a deep sleep. "Son, you don't have to talk to me. But I'm going to talk to you. And what you hear might not be polite. But I don't give a rat's ass what you think of my vernacular. You're a cunt, and you deserve to be here. You've disgraced this country and this world, and you have warranted a place in this here jail, one of the toughest jails you could ever get yourself trapped in. A breath, a sip of water, a bite of an apple. You're a very lucky fucker. I would have executed you on the spot, but there you go. Yet another sign of your fortune. I'm not the judge. But in here, I am the jury and I am the executioner. And you'll be a lucky motherfucker if you survive the next 10 years with all of your limbs intact. You see, I have how shall we put it, a certain way of convincing other inmates that, well, certain people need dispatching of, and you, my friend, I hate calling you that, you prick, fall under the category of notification. I bid you good day, Carlos, and wish you the best in my jail. You're going to need it. They brought him in today. Rooster smiled. I swear to God, that prick's on his way down here right now. Dennis Hart grinned. Well, he's in for a treat. I don't suppose that he knows we're here? Rooster grinned even wider. He has no fucking idea what's coming to him, boss. He's all over the place. What, drunk? Dennis asked, and then thought about it. It didn't matter. The grass was in. That was all that mattered. Carlos was a dead man, now that he was within grasp. We'll have him by lunchtime tomorrow, the little prick, Rooster said. We'll get rid of him. Rooster grinned. This was finally it. Nobody liked a grass, especially Dennis Hart. By lunchtime tomorrow, Carlos Silva would be a dead man. It was after 7 when Carlos Silva was led into his cell. He staggered, mumbled something inaudible, and was pushed onto the bottom bunk of the bed. After a fit of coughing, he tried to sit up, but couldn't. I'd stay down if I were you, Officer Michelson grinned. I've heard that Clay goes easier on you, the less of a fight you put up. With that, the cell door was slammed shut. The sound of rattling bars disappeared down the block. A few voices called out, informing the noisemaker that people are trying to fucking sleep here. Carlos coughed. This time, though, there was blood. It came from his nose, his mouth, and he felt his pants become suddenly wet as if he'd managed to piss himself, but he knew that it wasn't piss. The bed above creaked. Carlos managed to open his eyes momentarily, long enough to see 2 massive legs, tree trunks, swing over the side of the top bunk. It was dark in the cell, but it was the sweat in Carlos' eyes that made the shape almost impossible to focus upon. The legs dropped down, revealing a tattooed back, perhaps some sort of gang sign. It was hard to tell. The figure Carlos managed that much grunted as his feet touched the floor. The man must have been almost 7 foot, maybe more. He had a long, dark ponytail, and although Carlos was almost blind, he could just make it out as it swung back and forth between those hulking shoulder blades. Please, Carlos said. I don't want any trouble. The man turned and crouched next to the bottom bunk. His face, although blurry, could only be described as damaged. His grin revealed only 3 teeth, and even those were chipped. Carlos didn't need his eyes to smell the stale breath as it hit his face, making bile rise in his throat along with fresh blood. Be a good little boy, Cyrus Clay grunted, and there won't be none. That was all Carlos could remember before the consciousness drained from him, like the last few drops of water escaping from a hosepipe. The final thought in his mind before passing out was, "Please, kill me now. I'm ready for hell." There she was, as always, the most beautiful woman he had ever laid his eyes upon. This was the way the dream always started, and he liked this part of it. The calm before the storm, so to speak. She always strode into the room, that skimpy silk nightgown, the one that he'd bought her from London, leaving hardly anything to the imagination. She was delightful. Her lips glistened from something that she used to apply just before bedtime. It made them sticky. But Shane didn't mind, as it made her look so fucking fine. "Megan in bed?" Shane whispered, not taking his eyes from his wife. Holly nodded. "She had a big day at school today," she said as she brushed her hair in the full-length mirror at the foot of the bed. "Something about an animal man and how she got to stroke 3 cute little rabbits." Shane smiled. "She'll be wanting one of her own now." "Well, she'll have to go without," Holly said. "We're on the brink as it is without further expenses." She was right, she always was. Shane didn't deal with the bills or the taxes or the groceries. He just provided the money the government gave him, which was next to nothing. He had never been too good with figures, and they both agreed that Holly was in charge of the incomings and outgoings. Although Shane thought as he lay on the bed staring at her as she brushed her long, brown hair, it turns out that neither of us have been very good with the money. "I'm working on getting a job," Shane said, sighing. "It's this fucking recession. There's nothing about at the moment." "I know," Holly said, turning from the mirror. "It's not your fault. It's just that—" A pause. "I don't think we're going to be able to hold on to the house for much longer. Mama says we can always go stay with her for a while until we get—" "No way," Shane said, rising from the bed. "It won't ever come to that." There was no way in hell that Holly's mother, as nice as she was, would be the one to put things right this time. It wasn't solely Shane's stubbornness. His pride had always refused charity from anyone. If he was unable to do something by himself, then he went without. Though this time it wouldn't be just him that went without. He had Megan to think about. Would he be so stubborn if it really came down to it? Would he be able to put his daughter to bed at night in the back of the car, still in her school uniform? He doubted it. "I promise I'll sort something out in the next few days," Shane said as he put his arms around Holly's silky shoulders. "Just let me deal with it." Holly didn't have a choice. What could he possibly do, anyway? He'd been searching for a job for months. What were the chances that now, when the shit was really about to hit the fan, one would suddenly manifest? "Okay," she sighed. She nuzzled gently at his knuckles. "But if it comes to it, we're going to my mother's." Shane sighed. Okay. Yet he knew that he wouldn't allow that to happen. Ever. His heart raced so fast it was all he could do to not pass out. Sweat dripped from his forehead and nose in rivulets. The car radio drowned out the sound of his panicked breathing. Was he really going to do this? Could he? He had been sitting in the car for almost an hour. An empty bottle of water and a full ashtray served as a reminder for the time elapsed. The sun was pouring through the windscreen, and although he had the windows down and the sunroof fully opened, the heat was unbearable. He had contemplated a walk, maybe to take a closer look at the store, but decided against it. The only time he would leave the car would be to do the job. He was parked 100 feet or so away from the liquor store, and he was sure that nobody had really noticed him sitting there for so long. He had watched as couples, clearly underaged, had wandered into the store and left with bottles of booze, no doubt for a college keg party or some seedy house stew that would leave the parents with one hell of a repair bill. He had seen scores of middle-aged men, fresh from the day's loss at the bookies, enter and leave with whatever battery acid was the fucking cheapest. He had smoked almost 20 cigarettes while building up the courage to do what he was about to do. He reached up and pulled down the sun visor. A photograph, 6x8, portrayed Holly and Megan on a seesaw, the kind of old rust traps that you can no longer buy for health and safety purposes. "It's for you," he said. He closed the visor, climbed out of the car, and headed for the liquor store. Shane hadn't noticed the woman working the register press the button beneath the counter, but she must have. The cups were all over the place before he even had time to finish bagging the money. "You bitch!" he cried at the woman whose makeup had streamed down her face, leaving her looking like something from a cheap horror film. "You fucking bitch!" The sirens and sounds of squelching tires made it perfectly clear that most of the department had been dispatched. Shane couldn't see outside due to the stacked boxes and crates of beer that had been piled up in front of the windows. The only sunlight in the store emanated from the cooling fan on the far wall, sending an eerie shadow across the room as the fan spun. He had to think fast. "Where's the back door to this place?" he yelled at the hysterical teller. The lady, Arlene, he had noticed her name badge when he'd threatened to blow her head off, gasped as if there was no longer any air in the store. She couldn't speak. Instead, she just muttered incomprehensibly and pointed to the back of the room. "This is the Jackson Police Department," came the voice that Shane had anticipated. "Come out slowly with your hands up." Like that's gonna happen, Shane thought. He turned and headed for the back of the store, in the direction of the shaking, bony finger of the terrified Arlene. He could hear the crackling of police two-ways and the sound of a distant helicopter, but that couldn't be for him. Could it? Wiping the sweat from his eyes, he lunged through the door that would hopefully lead to a back alley. Places like this always had a loading bay of some sort, a place where the crates got delivered and stored until they're needed. This place, though, didn't. Shane stumbled straight through the door into possibly the worst toilet he had ever been in. "Fucking bitch, Arlene!" he yelled. There were 2 cubicles, a solitary urinal, and a sink that Shane suspected hadn't been used in a long fucking time. Above the sink there was a window, frosted and rotten. Without further thought, Shane climbed up onto the sink and grabbed hold of the lock. His heart sank when it wouldn't budge, either to the left or the right. He reached for the back of his jeans and pulled out the gun. A gun that was no more real than the ones available to buy for children at the seaside. Nevertheless, it was heavy enough to smash the bathroom window through. He thumped the glass with the butt of the pistol, BB pistol for fuck's sake, and the window exploded outwards. Making sure there were no sharp edges left to snag himself on, he climbed through and spilled out onto the street. The sunlight hit him first. The taser came soon after. Shane came awake as the electricity began to surge violently through his body. A slick film of sweat coated him from head to toe. A dream that he had almost every night, not just a dream, but a recollection of his mistake, could still cause him such panic and intense distress. He sighed. There would be no more sleep for him tonight. Billy Toombs pushed his tray in the general direction of the slush they called breakfast. Working the spoon that morning was one of the newbies, and that boded well for the food. There was no way on earth a fish was going to spit in the food, or worse. He was shaking even as he piled the scrambled eggs onto the side of Billy's plate. Shane tapped Billy on the arm, and they shared a silent smile that said, "Fuck me. This kid ain't gonna last long." The room was, as always, noisy as hell. Breakfast was the one meal that everyone turned up for. As the nervous spoon handler now slopped eggs onto Shane's plate, Shane glanced around the room. He could sense something. Something wrong was about to happen. The atmosphere had somehow changed. Not the volume, but the tension. Billy sensed it too. They moved along the line, receiving a solitary sausage which was almost unrecognizable, and a rasher of bacon that looked like something picked off a child's knee a few days after a nasty fall. Taking a seat, Billy looked to Shane. "You feel it too?" "Yep," he said, shoveling a forkful of sloppy egg into his mouth. "I've got your back." "I've got yours," Billy said, digging into his food. They were halfway through breakfast when it happened, and it was one of the strangest things either of them had ever seen. A man, also a newbie, staggered along the breakfast line, sweat pouring from his head and landing on his own plate. The man behind him, who Billy and Shane knew as Polly Sorvino, watched silently as the man began to drool all over his own breakfast, swaying back and forth as if intoxicated. "That's fucking disgusting," Polly said, taking a step away from the strange, drooling man. The room, as if someone was in control of a very large volume switch, faded to silence. All eyes fell on the breakfast line. A few of the men at the back of the room stood up, not wanting to miss what was almost certain to become a fight. The man turned from the line. Facing the rest of the room, he was clearly unwell. His eyes could barely focus, and sweat dripped from him in buckets. He staggered forward 1 step, 2 steps, and then almost fell backwards, which prompted a raucous howl of laughter from most of the watching prisoners. Shane didn't laugh. Something was seriously wrong with the man. "Hey," Polly said, realizing that he had the attention of the entire audience. "Somebody get this fucking guy another beer." More laughter. Polly was almost doubled over as the man continued to stagger through the room, bouncing from table to table. Some of the more violent prisoners began to push him about, laughing, encouraging the sick man to do something else funny. Cyrus Clay stood up. "It's all right for you fucking guys," he said, laughing. "I have to share a fucking cell with this fucking prick." The room erupted. Not laughing at Cyrus Clay's joke was a bad idea. Carlos Silva bounced around the room for a few more seconds before coming to a stop. He looked confused, almost as if he had been sleepwalking all along, and had woken up with no idea as to how he had got there. His eyes were blank. In fact, his entire face was expressionless. He looked like a painting. Something by Goya, perhaps. It was then that he vomited. The table in front of him got it the worst, but the ones to the left and right didn't remain clean. Carlos Silva was erupting. Prisoners were diving out of the way, falling from their chairs, their laughter silenced. Just cries of revulsion as the man spewed forth a never-ending torrent of guts. The eruption of violence that followed was incredible. Carlos Silva was lucky to still be breathing when the officers managed to pull off the other inmates. Officer Tyler, one of the more experienced guards, had witnessed the entire thing from the side of the room, and had only decided to step in once the filthy Mexican had received what he deemed suitable retribution from the vomit-covered thugs. "All right, everyone, back the fuck up," Tyler said with one hand on his taser. If the sick bastard decided to upchuck on Tyler's boots, then he better be prepared for a few 100,000 volts. The inmates separated. Rooster Hill, Marvin Murderer Manson, and Jimmy Gentle Rapist Kelly headed into the corner where Dennis Hart, the pack leader, sat nonchalantly finishing his dinner. Out of the three of them, only Jimmy Kelly had vomit on him, but it was clear that some of it had managed to get into his mouth. He was still wiping it away from his lips, and then scrubbing at his tongue as if he had just eaten something particularly rancid. They watched from the side as Cyrus Clay got one final kick in before stepping away. "See that sick shit, boss?" Cyrus said, pointing at the man rolling in agony on the canteen floor. "Shut the fuck up, Clay," Officer Tyler said. "If I had to eat in here with y'all sick fuckers, I'd find it hard to keep my food down." The guard radioed for assistance, explaining that he didn't want to get any of it on his clean uniform. Michelson said that he'd be over in a few minutes. Meanwhile, Carlos Silva managed to push himself up onto his knees. A long string of blackened sludge hung from his mouth, so that it was almost touching the floor. He was groaning and holding onto his stomach. Every few seconds he made a strange hissing sound, like a cat warning off a potential threat. Tyler put his foot on the sick man's side and gave him a little push. "Get up," he said, still keeping his hand on the taser. When Carlos failed to respond, his dark drool was now forming a deathly puddle on the canteen floor. Tyler said, "I will fucking taser you if you don't get up." Shane watched along with Billy as the guard kicked again. This time, though, the sick man did something remarkable. He grabbed the guard's ankle and sunk his teeth in. The expression that jumped onto Tyler's face would have been comical in other circumstances. As he screamed, he managed to pull out the taser gun and aimed it at Carlos Silva. The man on the floor, however, had no idea. He was way too busy trying to pull off the chunk of flesh that he had managed to clamp onto, and the funny thing was, despite what was happening, nobody moved a muscle. If anything, people stepped away, as if they wanted no part in the event. There were shouts and gasps, but nobody made to intervene. As Tyler leveled the taser, trying to stay focused, he knew that there was no way he could fire. The contact between himself and the growling piece of shit on the floor would mean that both of them would receive the current, and having been shot once before in training, he knew that he couldn't bring himself to fire. Luckily, he didn't have to. The flesh on Tyler's leg pulled away, like a chicken wing on a Sunday roast. The guard stumbled backwards a few feet before crashing through a chair and thumping to the floor. It was at this moment that Shane could see something was wrong. This was no sickness, no inane reaction to incarceration. There was something severely wrong with the new guy, something bad, even. The way he was growling, with thick black slime dribbling down his chin and cascading from his face like a hellish waterfall. The way his eyes had changed into nothingness, like deep pits of anger and hatred, with nothing in between. He was disturbed and yet seemed to be grinning. The man had just added a few months to his sentence, maybe even years for the bite, but it didn't seem to register. It was as if he knew that it was all over. He pushed himself up onto his haunches like a rabid wolf might in anticipation of its prey. He snapped at the air once, twice, and then he was airborne. Officer Tyler opened his eyes just in time to see into the man's bottomless pits. As they got closer and closer, his teeth still snapping at the air, Tyler screamed. The sound of a shotgun blast was the last thing he heard as the man landed on top of him. The prison went on 24-hour lockdown shortly afterwards. An event like this, one that culminated in violence towards one of the guards, always resulted in complete internment, with no prospect of yard time and meals being delivered to cells with no cutlery. It was the guards' way of reminding inmates that violence against staff would not be tolerated. It also resulted in cells being turned over, private items being removed and incinerated, and the occasional beatdown. The prison took such acts of vehemence against their own very personally. Tyler was taken to the infirmary. Although Shane didn't think his wound would recover with a few stitches and a handful of Tylenol, that was a mighty chunk ripped off. A skin graft might be the only solution. Billy Toombs sat in the corner of the cell. The book he held and was flicking through at such a voracious pace that Shane couldn't take his eyes from him was Something by Kurt Vonnegut. Billy would laugh intermittently, and Shane would laugh too. It was a strange sight, watching a man the size and build of Billy Toombs laugh at literature. He looked more like the kind of man that would find a savage dogfight comical. Shane watched, but he couldn't shake from his mind the events that had unfolded in the canteen that morning. How had that man, a man that had looked so sick and ill one moment, managed the strength to pounce from all fours like a wild animal the next? The way that he had managed to tear the flesh away from Officer Tyler's bone, as if it were nothing more than window putty, was something that required a lot of force. Any man, Shane didn't care how crazy, would realize that the chances of succeeding in finishing off a guard were slim, and the probability of either escaping or surviving the requital of the other guards was so slim that it was practically anorexic. Yet the man hadn't cared. His sole purpose was to cause as much damage as possible. It was his eyes, Shane thought to himself. His eyes had been empty, dark, infernal. Being in one of the toughest jails in the state, you came across evil on a daily basis. It was everywhere. If you turned your back in the shower, you made sure that your cellmate, providing he wasn't your main rapist, was spotting you. Items would go missing. Anything that could be carved or shaved into a weapon would mysteriously disappear, only to turn up a few days later covered in blood. Shane had lost 3 toothbrushes that way. The volition of the damned was an unstoppable force. Yet that man, Carlos Michelson had called him after blowing the top of his skull off, had not been just evil, or the misplacement of what should have obviously been a secure hospital transfer. He had been death itself. "You think he was right, don't you?" Billy said without looking up from his uproarious volume. "Hey, I've seen some things since I've been in here, man," he continued, "but I ain't never seen anything as crazy as that." He turned to the page, as if his statement had been nothing more than a footnote. Shane sighed. He'd seen his fair share of shit too, and this was also at the top of his list of things I never want to see again. Ever. "I don't know what happened out there, Billy," Shane said, wiping the sweat from his brow. It had become increasingly hot in the cell in the last 2 hours. Another thing the prison tended to do when an inmate stepped out of line was turn the heating up to almost intolerable temperatures. "I think he wasn't crazy. I think he was controlled." "Controlled?" Billy said, finally allowing his humorous novel to fall into his lap. "By who?" Shane shook his head. "I don't think he was controlled by anyone," he said. "Satan himself?" he added. This brought a massive laugh from Billy Toombs. "So you think the man was possessed?" he sneered. "I'm the token fucking Red Indian around here. Shouldn't I be the one who makes up inexplicable shit about forces and ghosts?" "He wasn't a ghost," Shane said. "But do you honestly believe that he was human?" There was a moment of silence while Billy pondered the farcical question offered to him. How could the man have been anything other than human? Monsters didn't exist, other than the kind that raped children, or burned down the houses of pregnant women in an effort to prevent them from having the wrong-colored baby. "What are you talking about, Shane?" Billy asked. He placed the book on a table beside him. This meant that he was either genuinely intrigued or severely pissed off. Shane sighed. Don't you just think that what happened out there was gravely wrong? I mean, that guy was fucking ill one moment, and the next he had the force of a panther. The guy was just pretending to be weak. Billy said, sniggering. We've all thought about it, about trying to outsmart the guards. This guy had the balls to actually try it. He failed, and now he's missing the top of his head. He picked his book up and returned to the page that was bookmarked. I wouldn't look too much into it, if I were you. Shane smiled. You're right, Billy. And yet he knew that he was right. That something bad was about to happen. So near, he thought, and yet so far. Freedom, he surmised, would have to wait. Marla Emmett pulled up the tray of dangerous-looking implements. She was beautiful, yet not in the conventional sense. She had the eyes, the lips, the breasts, and yet it seemed that her confidence was her main appealing factor. She was the type of woman that needed no man. Her own strength and sassiness were more than enough to get her through the working day. Her dark black hair trailed down her back, aiming towards the voluptuous thighs that nestled neatly in her prison-issued garb, and yet such shallow descriptions could never take away from her the fact that she was the only female graduate in the prison system in the state of Phoenix, and that she could count cards better than any professional poker player on the circuit. She could, in fact, complete a Sudoku puzzle in less than a minute, and had even won awards for her paintings, which one critic said reminded me of an early Renoir. "Is this gonna hurt, Doc?" Tyler said, whimpering like a child visiting the hairdressers for the very first time. Marla glanced casually at the wound, then said, "Probably. It was a deep bite, so I wouldn't be surprised if it stings a little." Tyler allowed his eyes to roll. Fucking typical. I get the chunk taken out of me, and he probably gets back to his cell with a meal and a goddamn certificate of virtue from the cribs. I hate this shit. Marla laughed. "Brace yourself," she said as she dipped the cotton wool in the iodine. "This is gonna sting." She wanted it to sting. To be perfectly honest, Officer Tyler had been nothing but a lecherous pest to her since her arrival. She tried to present a case, but there just wasn't enough evidence, and he'd walked away a free man, knowing that his advances had been inappropriate. What was it about the prison system that awarded the male staff complete immunity? Marla Emmett had no idea, so yes, she hoped that it stung like a motherfucker. The bastard deserved it. He gasped as she applied the wool to the leg. He even drooled a little, like a child refusing to take his medicine. "Fuck! That shit hurts," he grimaced. "Really?" Marla said, uninterested in his pain. In fact, she had expected a little more response. She had laced the iodine with salt in an attempt to induce more pain from the demoralizing pervert. "Shouldn't, really. It's just iodine." "Well, it feels like pure acid to me," he managed through gritted teeth. The ailed expression on his face made Marla want to laugh. He looked for a moment as if he was apt to pass out. She hoped that he would. But when he gasped again and blinked the pain away, she knew that it was unlikely. She dabbed the wound and placed the bloodied wool on the aluminum tray. "Looks like you're going to need a good few stitches in that," she said. "That man sure chewed you up pretty good." That delightful, wonderful man, she thought. Looking toward the open wound on his leg, Tyler shook his head. "He was like a fucking wild animal," he said. "An absolute maniac. I didn't even have time to taser the bastard. Shit, and I couldn't even pull my leg out of his mouth." This made Marla smile. The thought that Tyler, the sexual predator, had felt hopeless for even a second, seemed to lift some of the darkness she had felt during the tribunal. "I'm gonna make that bastard's life a misery when I get fixed up," Tyler snarled. "He's fucked with the wrong guard." Marla hesitated for a second, and then said, "Did they not tell you? They shot him in the head." Tyler blinked, unable to comprehend the new information. "They what?" "Apparently, Michelson answered your call for backup, but by the time he got there, things had already gotten out of hand." She kept her eyes trained on the needle which she was expertly threading. "Made a hell of a mess. The guy's down in the mortuary right now." Tyler thought about this for a moment, then smiled. "Serves the son of a bitch right for messing with me," he said. "Good old Michelson. Always knew that guy had the balls to kill someone." "Yeah," Marla said, positioning herself more suitably for the surgery ahead. "Anyway, here we go. You may feel a little discomfort." She used very little anesthetic. He felt a lot of discomfort. That night, the night when Officer Tyler had been stitched together so painfully, Carlos Silva lay on a trestle table, or at least most of him did. Dr. Jacob Strauss, a short, portly man wearing wire-rimmed spectacles, stood over the body, a dictaphone in one hand and a ham sandwich in the other. Between bites he added new observations, sometimes with his mouth still stuffed with bread. Strauss was good at his job. He had to be. Working at the prison had taught him many new things about cadavers, and although many of the bodies passing through his mortuary had certainly appeared to die from natural causes, more often than not there were other possible theories. He stuffed the remainder of the sandwich into his already crammed mouth and pulled on his double-thick autopsy gloves. Then he spoke into the dictaphone, announcing the time and date of the autopsy. It was, however, pretty clear what the cause of death had been. The man on the table had no cranium. Strauss chuckled to himself. "Yeah, that'll do it every time." He began to slice through the breastbone, speaking as he did so. He wondered why he bothered, though, as most of the tapes were filed under N, as in never to be listened to again. As he crunched through the sternum, the stench hit him almost immediately. It was at this point that he realized he had forgotten his face mask. He seldom wore one anyway. But as the rancid fetor stung his nostrils and the back of his throat, he wished he had on this occasion. Regaining his composure, he continued to talk aloud, although it was laborious. In all of his years as a mortician, he had never smelt anything so vile. And it was all he could do not to upchuck all over the poor bastard on the table. He reached for the shears and put them in place. A few crunches later, and he had opened the chest cavity completely. At first he thought he was hallucinating, that what he was seeing was purely imagination, or the effects of too little sleep, or not enough food. He blinked, glaring down at the mess. Where the lungs should be, there was just a black mass, so dark that it was almost impossible to determine where they started from the rest of the indescribable organs. The pericardial sac was blacker than the darkest night. Everything was covered in a liquefied goo. It looked like a sewer, not a person's insides. "Holy shit," Strauss panted. "What is this?" He picked up his camera and began to take photographs of the anomaly in front of him. When he'd been taking exterior photographs a few minutes prior, he had never envisioned that what lay within would be so disturbing. What is it? What the fuck is all of that black stuff? He took a few more photos and placed the camera down on the table. Still speechless, he stepped closer, gazing again down into the horrible chasm of black sludge and unidentifiable viscera. The stench seemed to be worsening, too. The entire room now smelled like a trucker's sock. For a few seconds, Dr. Jacob Strauss thought that he would vomit. But he closed his eyes, and eventually the nausea subsided. Glaring down at the dead man's open chest cavity once again, he decided to examine further. He reached across and picked up his scalpel. Not knowing where exactly to cut and not being able to see clearly, he opted to just aim for the heart and see what happened. His own heart was racing. He allowed the blade to slide across the black lump that had replaced the heart. In his ears he could hear the terrible hush thump of his own heart beating. "Fuck it," he said. He pushed the blade into the darkened organ. Immediately a sickening geyser of dark slush erupted from the glob. Strauss had no time to close his mouth, which was instantaneously filled with the putrid liquid. He tumbled backwards, crashing into the table, sending tools and equipment clattering onto the mortuary floor. The noise was immense, deafening. But the doctor was spitting and choking, trying his damnedest to rid his mouth of the vile substance. It tasted like off milk. Its warmth made him want to vomit. When the equipment had settled, and the room once again fell into silence, Strauss managed to pick himself up off the floor, pulling at his tongue with his gloved fingers, trying to get every ounce of stinking fluid out of his mouth. He thought right there and then that he would never get the taste out of it, that his tongue would forever smack of it. After a few minutes he allowed himself to swallow. He ignored the dead cadaver and made his way to the sink, where he drew some cold water and polished it off greedily. "Nasty fucking shit," he spat. His ass was sore from the fall, and his elbow had hit the aluminum table with such force that there was a small pool of blood soaking through his smock. Composure regained, Dr. Jacob Strauss took a few more photographs of the body before beginning the tedious task of embalming. The top of the head, though, would be impossible to stitch back on. "Not like he's gonna get viewers anyway," Strauss grinned, before going about his day without further calamity. That night after lights out, Jimmy Gentle Rapist Kelly sat on his bunk, gripping his stomach. "What the fuck's the matter with you?" Dennis Hart asked, with all of the compassion of a Gestapo thug. "You've been whining now for a fucking hour." Jimmy looked up. Sweat poured down his face and his eyes were sunken, as if he'd taken a particularly bad hit of crack. "I don't feel good, Den," he said breathlessly. "Ever since that fucker puked on me, I felt bad." Dennis Hart smiled. "I don't blame you. If some spick blew chunks all over me, I wouldn't be feeling none too good either." Putting his newspaper down, he wasn't reading it, but looking at the fine pair of tits some model had dangling off her. He stood. "At least it saved us doing the job, though. I've already got a 20 stretch, another 10 for whacking some dago, and I'd be in here till my fucking balls were no good anymore." He laughed. Jimmy Kelly didn't. "Well, fucking liven up, you pussy," Dennis snarled. "Anyone would think you were dying. Let me tell you something, Jimbo. Nobody ever died from being puked on." Jimmy straightened up. Even though the pain was still almost all he could bear, it wasn't wise to ignore Dennis Hart. If he tells you to liven up, you'd better jump out of bed and dance the fucking Macarena for him. It was one of the downsides to sharing a cell with such a man. Most people thought it a privilege. Jimmy Kelly would disagree. "See that fucking spick's head come off, Den?" Jimmy smiled through gritted teeth. "I ain't never seen anything like that in my life." "I wish I had one of those cannons," Dennis said. "I'd show those guys how to fire it properly. Tyler, Michelson, and Jensen. Then I'd go up to that fucking fancy office and blow Charles Dean a new asshole." Charles Dean, the governor, had treated Dennis Hart with all of the integrity he deserved. Years of shakedowns and beatdowns, drug planting and organized rape. Warden Dean reserved a distaste for Dennis Hart. More so than any other offender in the prison, Hart regarded this as a compliment. "You thinking of getting hold of one of those cannons any time soon?" Jimmy asked. Sweat dripped from the end of his nose and landed on the cell floor. Dennis Hart looked down and noticed that the drops of sweat had formed a small puddle. "Never gonna get the chance," Dennis said. "Although if I managed to somehow come across one, by chance, then I'd fucking put it to its best use. And I ain't talking about blowing the top of those pricks' heads off. I'd go on the rampage of all rampages." "I'd be with you, boss." Jimmy grimaced, clearly in a certain amount of discomfort. "All the way." "I know you would, Jim," Dennis said, once more glaring at the puddle of sweat forming on the floor. Perhaps he was ill. Maybe that fucking spick had given him some sort of disease, which he knew was possible because they didn't wash and they were always fucking around with farm animals and shit. I wouldn't have anybody else by my side. That night, Dennis Hart slept with one eye open. Governor Charles Dean poured himself another whiskey and downed it. The warmth as it hit his stomach was wonderful. So wonderful, in fact, that he poured himself another glass immediately. He reached for the wooden box that had always lived on his desk, opened it, and removed a cigar, one of the finest cigars he had ever smoked. Lighting it, he lounged back in his chair, blowing out a satisfied plume of smoke. The record player was currently churning out Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 in C minor, one of Governor Dean's favorites. His record player was a vintage Dansette, not one of those new-fangled all-singing, all-dancing CD things. The one thing Charles Dean hated more than criminals was pointless technology. What was the point in a device that could store hours of music when you couldn't even see the music that you owned? He was more of an owner. He liked to feel the books, to see the record slips, to have a complete library, not just a fucking miniature device that could be completely wiped of its storage if you accidentally dropped it into the toilet. As Beethoven spread throughout the office, and smoke rose in a blue miasma, Governor Dean realized that life could have been a fuckload worse. Sure, he'd had his troubles, and he had been divorced for almost 10 years, but to be completely honest, as he sat reclined in his leather chair sipping whiskey, he realized he had never been as happy, even when that bitch of a wife was still around. It had been a bad day at the office, or so the cliché went, and one of the new fish had been blown away, perhaps overzealously, perhaps not. But he was relaxed now. The man, Carlos Silva, had been kinless, which made the whole situation a hell of a lot easier to deal with. No immediate family meant no awkward phone calls. Carlos Silva would disappear from the face of the earth, incarcerated by the end of tomorrow, and that would be that. Charles Dean smiled. He almost fell backwards off his chair when the phone rang. He was caught mid-draw on his cigar, too, which meant that he had to cough it out of his system before answering. Once he had composed himself, he placed the cigar in an ashtray and picked up the receiver. "Hello," he said, still a little gruff. "Governor Dean, this better be important." The man at the other end of the line cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice trembled. "Governor, it's Dr. Strauss. I've sorted our body out, got him all stitched back together and all that." "Oh, Dr. Strauss," Dean said, smiling. That's very good news. Although, unfortunately, you've wasted your stitching skills on that there particular body. Turns out there is no next of kin, no persons to come view the body in state. He paused, took a drag on his cigar, exhaled the smoke, and continued. That poor boy ain't even gonna get a proper send-off, I'm afraid. Straight an old Bessie for him. Old Bessie was Governor Dean's nickname for the crematory. Bessie was also the name of his estranged wife. He had named the crematory after her because they both sucked the life out of you as painfully as possible and left you the shell of your former self. He found it comical, although nobody else in the prison understood it. That's a shame, Dr. Strauss said. Imagine dying and nobody even knowing, let alone caring. I'm sure that when it comes to it, Doctor, neither you or I shall have such worries. There was silence, apart from a slight rustle, which Charles Dean figured was a nod of assent coming from the doctor. I'm sure you're right, Strauss said finally. You want me to fire her up tonight, Governor, or can it wait until the morning? Charles Dean finished his whiskey and grimaced as the heat struck the back of his throat. No, you go on home, Doctor. I'm sure it will be there waiting for you when you return tomorrow. Strauss feigned laughter. Of course it fucking would. Bodies don't just get up and walk around. It will be the first job on my list, Governor. Very well, Doctor, Dean replied, and then hung the receiver back in its cradle. He smoked cigars, listened to Beethoven's Symphonies 1-9, and finished the bottle. By the time he fell asleep in his chair, he hadn't a care in the world. When he woke the following morning, it appeared that he had all of the troubles in the world hanging over him. It appeared that he had all of the troubles in the world hanging over him. What do you mean he's called in sick? Governor Dean asked. He had a very important job to do today. And to be honest, he sounded right as fucking rain when I spoke to him on the phone last night. I don't know, Gov, Officer Michelson said, taking a step back from Charles Dean. It didn't pay to stand too close to him when his mood was so unbalanced. He couldn't even call in himself. I just spoke to his wife. She sounded really concerned about him. She should be, Dean snapped. The prick might not have a job to come back to. Michelson knew that this wasn't an empty threat. He had seen Governor Dean fire at least 5 people in the last 2 years alone. One of them, a guard by the name of Carson, had been caught sneaking pornography in for some of the prisoners. It hadn't even been good pornography either. It was the kind of shit that the models kept their knickers on, or just pretended to be in the throes of an orgasm, even though off-camera they were more likely to be finishing the daily crossword. Carson, the poor asshole, had been summoned to the governor's office after a tip-off from one of the more, how shall we say, religious prisoners. Charles Dean had been waiting with the softcore magazines spread out on his desk, as if he'd been about to embark upon a masturbation fest of his own. When asked to explain himself, Carson simply had no answer, and was escorted from the premises by guards Tyler and Jensen. Governor Dean had reminded the remaining officers that any contraband, soft as shit, no pussy on display or otherwise, was not allowed within the prison walls, and that anyone who failed to comply with the simple rule would receive the same punishment as that pervert Carson. Michelson had guessed, though, that once the governor had the office to himself again, he would be spanking his own monkey over the laid-out magazines and centerfolds. So what else is happening today? Governor Dean asked. Other than visiting this afternoon, Michelson said, shrugging his shoulders. Not a great deal. Oh, shit. Visiting. It had completely slipped Charles Dean's mind. If there was one thing that Dean hated more than prisoners, more than pointless technology, and more than his ex-wife, it was fucking visiting day. Make sure that you keep a vigilant eye on that pack and their so-called visitors, Dean grimaced. I don't want any more weapons exchanging hands. The pack he referred to was, of course, Dennis Hart's lot. Rooster Hill, Marvin Manson, and Jimmy Kelly. Governor Dean was suspicious, actually pretty certain, that their visitors had been sneaking in all kinds of shit. Although there was no evidence of illegal substances or weaponry. Quite a few of the stabbings occurring in Block D were definitely not perpetrated by a shoddy blade knocked up in woodwork classes. The size of some of the wounds suggested a professional weapon, and somebody was bringing those shivs in. I'll keep my eyes peeled, Michelson said, trying to reassure the governor, even though he knew that he couldn't keep his eyes peeled on all four of the pack. You do that. As Michelson made his way out of the office, Charles Dean could only think about one thing. The decaying, headless corpse waiting to be burned in the mortuary. Only a few hours later, Governor Dean would wish that Carlos Silva was the only dead thing in the prison. Cyrus Clay sat in the infirmary, waiting for that fit piece of ass Emmett to emerge from the adjacent room. He looked around the room and realized that he had never set foot in the infirmary before. He'd never been ill nor shanked, but now he was here, and he felt like shit warmed up. His stomach was fizzing, almost as if he'd been slipped a suppository, and his head pounded so hard that he could see white spots dancing before his eyes. He had never felt so sick in his life. The door swung inwards, and Marla Emmett strode confidently into the room. She held in her hand a thick brown file folder, the kind that cost $1.50 for 100. Cyrus Clay wondered what could be in such a fat folder, since he'd never even visited the infirmary before. Probably a pile of shit about how many tattoos he had, and pictures of old wounds sustained before his incarceration. Paperwork was such a waste of time. Dr. Emmett opened the folder and sat silently reading for a few minutes before speaking. As she read, Cyrus Clay glanced down at those pert breasts of hers and wondered what it would feel like to stick his dick between them. And even though the pain was almost unbearable, his stomach seemed to jump inside him. He struggled to hide his forming erection. I said, the doctor snapped, how long have you been feeling like this? Judging by her abrasiveness, it wasn't the first time that she had asked the question. Ever since yesterday, Doc, Clay said, gripping his stomach as if to further convince the woman of his pain. Ever since that prick spewed in the canteen. Marla Emmett glared at Clay. It was clear that he was running a temperature. Sweat had formed a sheen on his forehead. His eyes were dark, too, almost as if he had been punched in them hard enough to leave a mark. Okay, she said, I'm going to give you some pills, take some blood, the usual. Cyrus Clay wondered whether the usual involved putting his dick between those beautiful pert breasts. The funny thing was he could, if he so desired. With a hand tightly pushed against her mouth, he could do what he wanted to her. He could fuck her 7 ways from Sunday, and the guards wouldn't even know about it until he let go of her. He was a lifer anyway. What could they do? Add another life sentence on? If he was going to die in jail, then he may as well get his dick wet while he was doing it. She started to take the blood. Cyrus watched the top of her head while she did it. He had an urge to just clamp down on her scalp and bite as hard as he could. For a moment he thought that he might do it. And then she spoke, which distracted him just at the right moment. "Are you having the pains right now?" she said. He looked away, suddenly aware that he was going to bite her fucking head off. Where had that come from? "Constantly," he replied. "Feels like somebody's poisoned me. That dirty fucking dago must have been really fucked up." It was true. The pain that Cyrus was feeling was enough for him to sympathize with Carlos Silva. Last night in the cell, Cyrus had raped the spick so hard that his dick had been covered with blood. Clay wasn't the kind of guy to feel remorse, but he understood now why his cellmate had simply accepted his fate. He hadn't the strength to fight back. "There must be some sort of virus going around," Marla said. "Let's just hope it doesn't spread through the whole system. I haven't got the time to test everyone." Cyrus Clay bit down on his tongue as the doctor drew his blood. "Good job I got in here first," he said. Again he felt the inexplicable desire to lean across and tear a chunk off the doctor's face. Her ear, in particular, suddenly looked rather tempting. When they finished, Marla called for the guards, who had been standing guard just outside, yet seemed to take forever to show up. "Is he done?" Michelson asked. "You didn't hurt him too much, did you, Doc?" He was grinning. Marla smiled. Cyrus didn't. "Officer, it's not my best nature to cause unnecessary pain to your prisoners." She said this and then thought back to Tyler and the way he had squealed as she cleaned his wound. Not in my nature, she thought, but sometimes it's in my best interests. "That's a shame," Michelson sniggered. He pulled Cyrus to his feet and began to cuff him. Cyrus felt the pain again. His stomach seemed to wrench deep down, as if he was going to be sick, but there was nothing to bring up. "Don't you dare be sick," Michelson said, noticing the strange way that his prisoner was bent over. "And don't be getting no ideas either. Just because you say you're ill doesn't guarantee you easy treatment. You've got shit to do, boy, and if she says that you're well enough to do it, then you're well enough to do it. In my book, the best thing for sick pricks like you is work. It'll help you take your mind off the pain." It wouldn't. Cyrus didn't think that anything could take his mind off the pain. He tried to recall when he had ever felt so bad and couldn't. This was terrible, almost to the point that he wished for death. "I wouldn't say that he's well enough to do anything just yet," Marla said. "He's running a really high fever, which means that he isn't lying, and he seems to be in substantial pain." She began to scrawl in her notes. The sound of the pen scratching the paper was the only sound for a few seconds. When she was done, she tore off a piece of paper and handed it to Officer Michelson. "Make sure you come and pick these pills up for him later on today. He needs to take one every 4 hours until the pain subsides." Michelson wasn't happy. He practically snatched the script from her. "Do you want me to wipe his ass for him as well?" he snarled. Marla suddenly felt uncomfortable. She sat down behind her desk and glared up at the officer, who was obviously perturbed. "I think you should make sure that he gets those tablets every 4 hours, she said. The officer seemed to nod along with every word that she said, but deep down he had no intentions of taking orders from a fucking doctor. "I will need to see him again tomorrow, check his progress. If he informs me that you haven't been providing the pills, then I will make a formal complaint and hand-deliver it straight to Warden Dean. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Michelson didn't know what hurt the most, the way she was speaking to him, or the fact that she had every right to make a complaint if the prick didn't get his medicine. As much as Charles Dean hated the prisoners, he didn't piss them off for no good reason. "He'll get the fucking pills," Michelson grunted. Do you hear that, Nancy boy? You'll get your pussy medicine to make your tummy ache go away. He was pushing Cyrus Clay towards the door as he spoke. The nice doctor here will tell on me if I don't give you what you need. He left the office, slamming the door so hard that the entire room appeared to tremble. Marla leaned forward in her chair. She picked up the phial of blood and stared at it. "Let's get you sent off," she said. Officer Michelson could be heard cursing all the way down the corridor. The prisoners were finally allotted some yard time, which was good news for a few of the ones who had already started to go stir-crazy. 4 walls did that to a person, especially when those 4 walls were all that you were going to see for the rest of your natural life. It was overcast, and as Shane made his way out onto the basketball court, a few drops of rain had already hit him. Small flowers of water bloomed on the shoulders of his coveralls. "Decided to let us out and we're gonna get fucking pissed on," Shane said, accepting the ball from Billy Toombs. "Should have known there'd be a catch." "Just be grateful we're out here at all," Billy said. "From what I heard, the guards took a vote. I don't care if it's hailing golf balls, so long as I can stretch my legs." With visiting on this afternoon, Billy had nothing else to look forward to. He had had, as far as Shane could recall, no visitors since they had been celled up together. When Shane had questioned Billy about it, he'd simply said, "I have my friends right here," and pointed to the pile of books on the table in front of him. For a man to discard the people in his life, or in this case accept that they had discarded him and turn to literature, was a tough thing to do. To Billy, though, words were all that he needed to get through the day. As long as he had a constant supply of reading material, he was happy. The days simply rolled into one another. "Is Holly coming to see you today?" Billy asked. He tossed the ball across to Shane, who leapt up and guided it between the chain knit. "Nice shot." Shane scooped up the ball. "She said she was," he said. "I hope she does. But I'm not sure I want her turning up here if there's some kind of nasty virus going around." Billy received the ball from Shane. "I heard Cyrus is pretty bad with it," he said. "Whatever it is, I don't want it. People have been talking all kinds of crazy shit. You know how it is, the way stories get out of hand. The last I heard, Clay was pissing blood and praying to God. That fucker's the least religious person I've ever met. So if it's true, then he must be in all kinds of pain." "Who did you hear that from?" Shane asked. He stopped jumping around. His breathing was laborious. "That new kid, the one working the spoon. I don't think he's the type to start rumors." "He's the type to believe any old shit he hears," Shane said as he held out his hands. Billy bounced him the ball. He grabbed it and launched it in the direction of the net, and it almost fell in. After 3 bounces on the wire, it hit the backboard and bounced off to the side. The rain was now hitting the ground and jumping back up. "Fucking typical," Shane grimaced. The yard was emptying. The prisoners had stretched their legs and were heading back inside. Family and friends would be along shortly to bullshit about the outside world. Shane would be seeing his wife again, possibly for the final time before his release. "Let's get back inside," Billy said. "You look like a drowned rat." Warden Dean was pissed off so badly that he wanted one of his officers to make a mistake, just so he could fire their sorry ass. He loaded the remains of Carlos Silva into old Bessie and searched the control panel for the button that took care of the fire. He was expecting to see a big red switch, or even a button with a picture of a flame on it, like a gas cooker, but there was nothing of the sort. Whoever had designed this piece of shit had not taken into consideration that somebody without a PhD in engineering would occasionally need to use it. Warden Dean was a smart man, at least he thought he was, so how could an Austrian or German or whatever the fuck Strauss was operate the machine with such finesse? It was almost embarrassing. "Sick my ass," he muttered under his breath. "He'll be sick when he gets back to work. I'll make pretty damn sure of that." There were laminated instructions nailed to the wall at the side of the incinerator, but they might as well have been written in hieroglyphics for all of the good that they were. There was something about pressure checks, and then something else about temperature gauge. In the end, Charles Dean decided that it would be best to wait for the mortician to return. It was not a good idea to play with fire in his own prison. Might end up nuking the place. He decided to leave Carlos Silva's body in the incinerator, though, mainly because he couldn't be bothered to get it back out. What would it hurt? He wasn't going to stink the place out. Not if the door was kept shut. After making sure that everything was securely locked, the warden headed back upstairs. "Fucking visiting," he grumbled. "I hate fucking visiting." They were led out into the room by Jensen and Tyler. The latter was still limping from his leg injury, and with every step that he took, the pain was visible on his face. Shane almost felt sorry for the guard, but not quite. There was a loud siren, which meant that the half-hour visiting had begun. Shane hadn't even taken his seat. "How's life treating you?" Holly asked. The gorgeous smile that stretched across her face lit up Shane's insides. It was a smile that said everything will be fine soon. Shane pulled the seat out from the table and sat. "You look beautiful," he said. "I wasn't sure if you would come, the weather being so shit." "It would take more than just the weather to keep me away from you," she said, gripping his hand across the table. In the corner of the room, Officer Tyler watched like a hawk, making sure that no contraband had exchanged hands, although he knew Shane Bridge and had never had an issue with him. The man was coming to the end of his term, so the chances of him trying to smuggle into the prison were slim, unless he was really stupid. "How's Megan?" asked Shane. "She still doing well at school?" The last time Holly had visited, Megan had been named as class prefect, which Shane thought was odd for a 7-year-old. But everything was different now. They even had their own prom at 7. "She's doing great," Holly nodded. "She misses her daddy, but she knows that he'll be home soon." She laughed. "She gets really excited when she talks about it. Sometimes I have to tell her to calm down." Shane grinned. "Really?" "I swear," Holly said. "She's written songs about it and everything." In that moment, Shane forgot that he was in prison. To hear that his daughter was already celebrating his release was amazing, and he couldn't wait to get home now and hold her. The way he should have been holding her for the last 3 years. He had missed her growing into the girl she had, but he could at least be happy that she didn't detest him for it. "How's your mother?" Shane asked. "She's not too well at the moment," Holly replied, a smile dropping from her face. "The doctors think that she may have emphysema. I told her she should have quit smoking a long time ago, but would she have it? No. And now look." This was the first that Shane had heard of Holly's mother's problem, but it came as no surprise. The woman smoked 30 a day, and had done so since she was 20. It was only a matter of time before it caught up with her. "She'll bounce back," Shane said, although he doubted it. "Shane, she's 60 and has to inhale steroids. What do you think she's going to do? Start yoga?" He shouldn't have, but he laughed. The sight of Holly's mother bending into unnatural positions with a fag in one hand and a glass of wine in the other was too much. "It's not funny," Holly said, and then she started to laugh too. "Shane, stop it. She might not last for much longer." "Then tell her that yoga is a bad idea," Shane sniggered. They laughed together for a while. Glossing over the problem seemed to have done the trick, and although Holly was worried sick about her mother, making a joke about it made the problem seem less important. "You and Holly started to pack your things up yet?" said Shane. Holly looked surprised. "What do you mean?" "At your mom's?" he said. "Have you got all of your stuff together for when I get out?" She frowned. "Shane, we have nowhere to go. You'll have to come stay with my parents for a while until you get back on your feet." The anger that Shane suddenly felt course through him was almost unbearable. The whole reason he was in prison was because of his stubborn refusal to accept any help from Holly's mother, and yet here he was, on the brink of freedom, and he would be forced to just set up home with the in-laws. "We talked about this," Shane said. "You did," Holly said. "It's easy for you to talk about it stuck in here, but we had nowhere else to go. And until we get set up and you get a job, we'll have no choice but to stay with my mom and dad." Great, Shane thought. I could have avoided a 3-stretch all along, and by now we'd be sorted with a place of our own again. Arguing was not what Shane wanted. There was nothing worse than falling out with Holly and then being shepherded back to his cell where he would have nothing to mull over except for all of the bad things that they said to each other. It was enough to drive a man insane. He smiled. "You're right," he said. "I'll get a job as soon as I get out. Who knows, huh? Might even go for a job as one of these." He nudged a finger in the general direction of Officer Tyler. He turned in his chair. "How much do you make after tax?" he said to the guard. "Not enough to look at your ugly face every day," Tyler said, but there was something strange about the way he said it, breathless, pained even. When Shane turned back to the table, Holly asked, "What's wrong with him?" "Some virus doing the rounds," Shane said. "Let's just hope that I don't get it before I get a chance to have a proper munch on Megan." "I'll tell her you said that," Holly smiled. "That'll make her day." For the 15 minutes that followed, they talked about how Holly had taken an art course at college and was hoping to even showcase some of her work at the local gallery. They discussed Holly's father, who had built yet another shed in the back garden, taking the tally up to 4 in total. Shane wondered if he was planning on renting them out to immigrants to make up a bit of extra cash. They talked about Holly's newly discovered interest in all things Justin Bieber, who Shane had never heard of before, but would be having a stern talk with Holly about when he was released. Talking about these things made Shane realize that he was about to embark upon a new chapter in life. He was going home, finally, and although certain things had changed, the 2 most important people in his life remained exactly the same. As the sirens sounded to announce the end of visiting time, Shane didn't feel the usual sinking feeling he usually did. He kissed Holly, not noticing Officer Jensen standing against the wall and admiring Shane's wife as if she was his own. "I'll see you soon," Holly said as she was ushered out of the door, a tide of less significant visitors following her through it. She blew him a final kiss before she was edged out of sight. The prisoners left behind in the visiting room watched as Officer Tyler staggered, banged his head on the far wall, and hit the deck with a thud. "Holy shit!" cried Officer Jensen. He reached for his 2-way and called for help. With the taste of Holly still on his lips, Shane watched as the guard writhed and spasmed, cheered on by the rest of the prisoners, who thought it was the best show they had ever seen. Something, Shane thought, was definitely not right. "I have a home to go to," Marla said, although Warden Dean simply could not grasp the concept. "I know there's something going around, but I'm not a witch. I can't just make it all stop." "Then why the fuck do I employ you?" Charles Dean snarled. "You don't seem to have the slightest clue what is happening here. All I know is that one of my men was bitten yesterday, and now he's stretched out unconscious with some sort of super bug that, stop me if I'm wrong, you should be aware of." "I'm not in the CDC," Marla retorted. "When was the last time you noticed me wearing a biological suit, huh? Never, because I don't deal with superbugs. I patch up your prisoners when they get stabbed. I make sure they get their aspirin if they get a migraine. I never said I could prevent the plague." "That's what you think this is?" Charles asked with an expression that suggested he had already thought about it himself. "Some sort of supervirus?" Marla took a step back. The room all of a sudden didn't seem big enough for both of them. "I'm not suggesting anything," she said. "All I know is that I have a life out of work, and I would like to live it. You know the protocol. Those infected should be taken to the hospital under guard. There is nothing more that I can do for them." "Protocol," Charles grunted. "What the fuck do you know about protocol? You just walk around here teasing, and then complaining when somebody takes you up on the offer." Marla didn't know what happened, but before she could do anything about it, her hand was already connecting with the side of the warden's face. His head jolted backwards, and his eyes bulged with the shock that followed. "How dare you," she said. "You know that your fucking guard was out of line." Charles didn't speak. He couldn't. He was still mortally offended that she had slapped him. He had gone a peculiar shade of red, too, which made him look as if he might explode at any given moment. "If you don't put the call in to transfer Officer Tyler and Cyrus Clay, then I will." She said it knowing that it would prompt a response from the man, who would never let her do such a thing. "I'll make the call," he said. "But if I were you, I would start to look for another job, because I believe that you are of no further use to this facility." Marla smiled. "First thing tomorrow," she said, and turned to head for the door. She managed 2 steps before an alarm went off. It wasn't the fire alarm, which she had heard on numerous occasions. This one she didn't recognize. She turned to find Charles Dean looking slightly anxious. "Looks like you won't be going anywhere just yet," he said. "Can you see anything out there?" Billy Toombs asked. He was still clenching his book, aware that the chances of an actual riot were slim. "I can see a few of the guards running around at the end of the row," Shane said. "Apart from that, everybody seems to be in their cells." He looked out at the cells across the landing. Prisoners were pressed against the bars, trying to get a better look. A few of them were shouting obscenities towards the guards, who ran past with baffled expressions. The alarm seemed to go on forever, and after a while, the shrill scream that filled the prison was enough to give everyone a migraine. "Probably a suicide," Billy said, picking up where he had left off with Vonnegut. "Maybe," Shane replied. "But they try to keep suicides quiet, don't they? Why would they be raising the roof with that fucking racket if someone had hung themselves with their own bed linen?" No, something was happening, and Shane knew that it was something to do with the people falling sick. "Is he dead?" Dennis Hart spluttered, grasping at the open wound on his neck to prevent the blood from squirting out so freely. "Make sure he's fucking dead this time." The body of Jimmy Kelly lay outstretched just outside the cell. Jimmy had attacked Dennis, ripped a chunk out of his neck, and kept on coming until the guards arrived. Michelson had been the first on the scene, and wasn't sure what was happening until he opened the cell door. It was then that Jimmy turned, growled, and leapt for the guard, his eyes filled with darkness, his throat filled with the blood of his cellmate. Luckily for Michelson, the baton had met the crazed man's face quite cleanly. A few teeth shot out and clattered against the cell wall, but even that had not been enough to deter Jimmy Kelly, who had clambered to his feet and started after the guard once again. It had taken at least 15 more hits from the baton to put him down, which was not right at all. One should have been enough, especially to the skull, which is where the guard had concentrated his attack. It was then that the alarm had been sounded. Dennis Hart struggled to his feet and began to approach Michelson, who was breathless and confused and leaning against the cell wall for stability. "Make sure he's dead," Dennis managed, but white lights began to dance in front of his eyes and he almost toppled over. The guard straightened up and took a deep breath. He glanced over to where Jimmy Kelly lay, still and destroyed. "He's fucking dead," he said. "Look at his head." Indeed, there was a hole big enough to put your foot through on the back of Jimmy's head. Bits of brain and gray matter dangled out through the hole like some foreign cuisine. Dennis shook his head. "I can't believe he fucking bit me," he said. "Just came for me for no reason. I swear to God, if I find out that someone's got a contract out on me—" "Shut up," Michelson roared. Dennis took a step back. The guard, although fatigued, was still clenching the baton in his hand, and still wore the expression of somebody willing to use it. The noise of the alarm was making it impossible to think, and in that moment Michelson needed to get his head together long enough to figure out what had just happened. In the cell, Dennis stumbled and fell onto the bottom bunk of his bed, cracking his face on the wooden frame as he went. He had lost a lot of blood. He knew that, and it was still spurting out of him like a geyser, spraying the bedclothes, covering the wall. The cell would take forever to clean, Dennis thought, as he lay motionless on the bed, his legs hanging over the edge. "If I find out they got a contract," Dennis said, but unconsciousness came before he had a chance to finish. Between the bars of the cell, Officer Michelson waited for backup. Charles Dean marched up the steps to the second floor, grunting to himself occasionally. If someone was trying to escape again, he was going to make an example of them. He couldn't understand why one of his prisoners would even attempt to break out, though. This was one of the most secure prisons in the world. The chances of succeeding were about as likely as breaking out of Alcatraz. He reached the second floor and turned right, past the first row of cells. A few of the inmates backed away at the sight of the governor, not wishing to put themselves in the line of fire. Rooster Hill yelled, "Go get him, boss!" which made Charles quicken his pace. He reached for his two-way and called for backup, which was apparently already on its way. By the time he reached the third floor, there would already be a small army of guards waiting, some of them off duty, but that didn't make a blind bit of difference to Charles Dean. He wanted as many of them as he could get a hold of, and if that meant that they forfeit their smoking break, then it was a small price to pay for the continual success of the prison's reputation. He was at the end of the second-floor row when he heard the grunt, a low, animalistic growl that made the hairs on the nape of his neck stand straight up. He turned to make sure that nobody was behind him, and was about to ignore the noise entirely when it came once again. This time he had to take a look. Someone was fucking with him. Not a good idea. He looked into the first cell, the one on the corner of the row. Two prisoners stared back at him. One of them shrugged, which meant that they had heard the growl above the noise of the alarm, too. He moved across to the next cell, his hand creeping ever so slowly towards the gun on his belt. Again confused prisoners stared back at him, only this time one of them pointed through the wall to the next cell. Cyrus Clay, Charles thought. Should have known it was that piece of shit. He stepped across, expecting to find Cyrus grinning back at him from his bunk, but he wasn't there. He was hunched up on the floor of the cell with his back to Charles. The floor glistened as a pool of darkness spread outwards from the huddled figure. "Clay, on your feet," Charles said, his hand now firmly holding the handle of his pistol. Under current circumstances, Charles Dean didn't think he would hesitate not for 1 second to use the gun. Cyrus Clay just growled again, which pissed the governor off. "I said get the fuck up!" Cyrus Clay's head snapped around. His teeth were dripping with a thick black substance which looked to Charles Dean like tar. He remained hunched over, but he now resembled an owl, with his head turned almost entirely around. His eyes were bleeding with the same black ooze that trickled out of his mouth. Charles looked into those eyes for a few seconds before looking away. The darkness was almost too much to take, and staring into the void for too long might drive a man crazy. "What the fuck, Clay?" Charles managed. He hadn't noticed, but he had instinctively drawn his pistol and had his finger on the trigger ready. Cyrus grunted, stood, and turned to face the governor. His arm, Charles noticed, was missing quite a lot of flesh, which would explain the mess around the prisoner's lips. He had been eating his own arm. Charles couldn't believe what he was seeing, but he had to, didn't he? His own eyes didn't lie. He was staring at a man who had, up until a few moments ago, been ripping into his own flesh. Had Cyrus finally gone over the edge? Was he really insane? Charles hoped not. He didn't relish the thought of all the paperwork that came with transferring a prisoner to a secure hospital. "Don't move another," Charles began, but it was too late. Clay was already running toward the bars. His arms stretched out, his teeth bared. He certainly looked like a mental patient. When he hit the bars, his nose broke instantly. There was a squelch and blood shot out of Clay's face. Some of the black gunk which had filled his mouth hit the floor, with the sound of treacle landing on a countertop. His eyes suggested surprise as he bounced off the bars, but that didn't prevent him from giving it another try. He shot forward, clattered the bars again, all the time growling and moaning. His head split on the left side, which should have hurt even a mental person. But if it did, then Clay didn't show it. "Back up!" Charles called, but it made no difference. Clay kept on coming, and seemed to hit the bars with more force every time. In the end, the governor decided that he would deal with the disturbed prisoner later on. He had to get up to the 3rd floor. "Don't leave us down here with him," a prisoner called out as Charles Dean disappeared around the corner. "Shut up," the governor replied as he ran up the flight of stairs to the 3rd floor. "What, so you had to hit him so much that his brain came out?" Jensen asked Michelson. "That's pretty fucked up, man." And it was. In all of his years as a prison guard, Michelson had never seen anything like it. "He just kept on coming," Michelson said. "I had no choice. You've seen what he's done to Hart." Jensen glanced into the cell. He could see Dennis Hart's feet, which were twitching over the edge of the bed, but that was all. The blood that had sprayed all over the walls and floor confirmed it for Officer Jensen. He didn't want to see the wound on Hart's neck. "What the fuck is going on up here?" Charles Dean asked, as he huffed and puffed his way along the row. "Will somebody turn that goddamned alarm off before I go fucking deaf?" One of the other guards, a short fat man by the name of Reynolds, saluted the governor before running off down the stairs. Reynolds was keen, but a little too keen sometimes, and as he disappeared in search of the alarm controls, Charles Dean tried to remember the poor guy's name, and couldn't. "What happened to Kelly?" Charles asked. The body had been flipped over. Jimmy Kelly's one eye was hanging down the side of his face. "I had to," Michelson said. "He was trying to get to me, sir. I think he wanted to bite me." "I don't care if he wanted to fuck you, Michelson. You do not kill prisoners with excessive force." "Like I said, Gov, I had no choice. I hit him, and he kept on getting up and coming at me. He'd already ripped a chunk out of Hart." Charles Dean smiled. At least something good had come out of it. "Where is he?" "On his bunk," Jensen said. "But judging by the mess in there, I don't think he's going to make it, Gov." Charles glared into the cell, expecting to see Dennis Hart lying on his bed, dying a slow and painful death. When he saw the man running towards him with no cage between them to prevent it, he said, "Holy shit!" As Hart hit the governor, they both went backwards, toppled over the railings, and fell 3 floors down. Marla didn't know what to do. She would have been bored were it not for the unique collection of music to browse on the shelves in Charles Dean's office. There were jazz records, classical, blues. She even found a signed, first-edition copy of Michael Jackson's Thriller, which was out of place amongst the rest of the collection. The office, she surmised, was a sign of the governor's unparalleled machismo. There were certificates announcing Charles Dean's adeptness down at the gun club. There were trophies scattered haphazardly around the room with little men sitting atop them, playing golf. Marla located the drinks cabinet, which was cleverly concealed within a gilt-coated globe of the world. She poured herself a small whiskey and sighed. "Will somebody turn off that godforsaken alarm?" she said, sipping her drink, and reading through some notes on the governor's desk, which meant absolutely nothing to her. In a silver frame on the desk, there was a photograph of Charles with two young girls. It was the typical daddy-daughter picture, with smiles all around and love glinting in everyone's eyes. She wondered if his girls were aware of their father's brutality, or whether they had ever been on the receiving end of it while growing up. It wouldn't surprise her. A few more minutes passed. Marla refilled her glass, knowing that she could finish the entire bottle and it would make no difference, although she did have to drive home, and the last thing she needed after the day she had was to get pulled over by the police. Tomorrow, she would be on the lookout for a new job, something different, hopefully something that she would be appreciated for. She could always try and get back into Russell's, which was the hospital that she had worked at before resuming her post in the prison. It wasn't a bad hospital to work at, and she had gotten along quite well with her colleagues. If they would take her back, then it might be something to consider. The alarm continued to annoy her as she worked her way through the second glass of whiskey. "The fall would have killed them," Jensen cried. "It makes no sense." They peered over the railings at the two men on the ground floor. Dennis Hart was growling and ripping through Charles Dean's stomach. Intestines were being pulled out, and Hart proceeded to bite at them, yanking them apart with his teeth. "We need to get somewhere safe," Michelson said. "I've seen some crazy shit in my time, but this is something else." He knew what he meant when he said somewhere safe. The armory, where all of the guns were at. Dennis Hart continued to gnaw through the fresh cadaver before him. The alarm continued to sound in its shrill pitch. Everything continued to get gradually worse. The cards went into the middle of the table. Rooster was not happy, as he had lost 3 games on the trot. Marvin Manson, on the other hand, couldn't believe his luck. So far he had won 20 cigarettes, and none of those shitty menthol things that Rooster smoked, and $23 in cash, which could get you quite a lot of stuff if you knew where to go for it. The constant alarm didn't seem to be putting him off his stride at all. "Your deal," Marvin said, pushing the cards across the table to his cellmate. Rooster picked up the cards and began to shuffle. "If I was a betting man," he said, while he began to handle the cards expertly, "I'd say that Dennis is the reason that alarm's still ringing." "You think?" "Who else is up on third that might cause such a nuisance?" Marvin nodded in agreement. "But he wouldn't be trying to escape," he said. "He knows better than that." "He might be welcoming one of the fishes a little too roughly," Rooster sniggered. "You know what he gets like when he's pissed off." Rooster began to deal the cards, counting silently in his head as he did so. "What are the stakes this game?" Marvin asked, feeling lucky. "I'm out of cash," Rooster said, placing the rest of the deck in the middle of the table. "How about if I win? I get to go on your mother when I get out of here. And if you win, you get to fuck my sister." Marvin laughed. "Have you seen the state of my mother?" he said. "Yeah, but you haven't seen the fucking state of my sister," Rooster cackled. "Even I wouldn't fuck her." "In that case, you're on," Marvin laughed. They played the hand. Rooster lost, and Marvin began to make plans to pay his friend's sister a visit upon release. Reynolds ran to the end of the block, and when he got there he couldn't breathe. He reached into his pocket, pulled out an inhaler, and sucked it, pressing the button several times before giving it a shake and trying again. His asthma had never been a problem at work before. Then again, he had never moved so sharply at work before, and he felt like he had no choice but to move as quickly as possible. He pocketed the inhaler and entered the gate which led to the control panel. He could hear the prisoner starting to get increasingly frustrated by the din of the alarm, which was not a good thing. So the quicker he worked, the better. He looked for something on the walls, but when you didn't know quite what you were looking for, then it was harder than it looked. There were a few levers and switches, all of which looked electrical, but most of them were labeled with colored stickers. One said main lights, another said yard. The next one didn't have a colored sticker on, but a sign hung around the handle that said, "Do not touch." Officer Reynolds decided that it was the kind of instruction that the alarm would have written on it, so gave it a quick tug. When nothing happened, or at least nothing that was instantly noticeable, he moved along the wall. Eventually he found the override box. It had "Manual Alarm Override" printed on it in big yellow letters, pulled open the little door on the front of it, and inserted the key. It was a key that all of the guards were issued with, but one that he had never used before. He turned the key, and immediately the alarm ceased its incessant racket. The prisoners were even louder for a few seconds, and then quieted down, happy that they could finally get some sleep. Yes, Officer Reynolds smiled. He would be commended for his quick work, and would be noticed by Charles Dean as one of the better guards under his command, which wasn't hard. All you had to do was take a good hard look at Michelson, Jensen, Tyler, and a few of the others. You soon realized that they were corrupt. It was only a matter of time before the governor figured out that Reynolds was, in fact, the best of a bad bunch. He closed the override box and headed back up to the 3rd floor, where he hoped he would be the recipient of a pat on the back by his boss. Shane was about to ask Billy Toombs what he found so funny about Kurt Vonnegut when the click came. It was a sound that he and all of the other inmates were very familiar with. But why now? Why had the gates been unlocked now at night? "Check it," Billy said, pointing to the barred gate at the front of the cell. "Must be some sort of mechanical failure." Shane stepped up to the gate and gave it a pull. When it slid across and slammed against the stopper on the other side of the cell, he couldn't quite believe it. "Shh," Billy urged. He could see that Shane was about to lose it, probably shout out to all and sundry that the cells were open. Billy reminded him just in time that such an action was probably not a good idea. The alarm had maybe drowned out the mechanical click for most of the prisoners, and the ones who had heard it might not cotton on what it actually was. Then the alarm stopped. The ringing continued, though, inside Shane's own ears. He wondered how long that would last for. "Mechanical malfunction?" Shane asked. "That's something that's never happened before." Billy nodded. "Somebody's going to get fired over it." Shane turned and glanced out. Across the railings, prisoners were screaming and shouting as they pulled across their cell doors. The 2nd floor was exactly the same, and Shane didn't need to leave the sanctuary of Cell 101 to know that the 3rd floor were already aware of the malfunction, and were leaving their cells amidst cheers and bouts of excited violence. "Somebody's going to hang for this," Shane said. Shane said. Officer Reynolds stopped moving when he heard the faint crackling noise behind him. It sounded like somebody was walking across bubble wrap. The darkness made it almost impossible to see where he was going, and he made a mental note to remind Charles Dean that there was a distinct lack of lighting over by the infirmary. The crackling stopped, leaving only Reynolds' laborious breathing. Through the darkness he could see the door to the infirmary was wide open. He watched as it swung half shut before opening again. As it hit the spring stopper on the floor, there was the sound that Reynolds had mistaken for bubble wrap being popped, which put his mind at rest momentarily. A slight breeze whipped through the corridor, hitting Reynolds, causing him to shiver. He made his way into the infirmary to locate the source of the breeze. There was one window obviously barred, but it had been left slightly ajar, no doubt to cool whoever had been lying sick in the empty bed against the far wall. After closing the window, he decided to take a quick look around to make sure that nothing else was amiss. It would all go in his favor when reported to the governor, and the more things he found, the likelier it was that he would get the promotion that he so eagerly yearned for. The sheets on the empty bed, he noticed, were sodden with blood. He would mention that to Charles Dean, as it was obviously against some sort of regulation that he was currently unaware of. There was a drip standing next to the bed, which had apparently been unhooked from the patient with haste. A chunk of flesh encased the needle at the end of the line. That, Officer Reynolds thought, was obviously wrong. And as much as he liked Dr. Emmett, liked her so much, in fact, that he had a few secret pictures of her on his mobile phone, he would quite comfortably sacrifice her position in the prison to elevate his own. "What the?" Reynolds said to nobody, as he noticed the bloody footprints leading away from the bed. Whoever they had belonged to must have been dragging one leg, as one side of the trail was smeared. Being heroic was certainly below his pay grade, but he couldn't help it. He felt his own feet moving in the direction of the gory trail, which must lead to the injured party eventually. He followed them into an adjoining room. The sign on the door informed Reynolds that it was a room where medical supplies were kept. The light provided by the prior room soon diminished, however, and Officer Reynolds found himself standing in near darkness, wishing that he hadn't been so stupidly inquisitive. He could make out certain objects on the shelves. There was a pile of boxes which contained latex gloves, and he could see a row of empty urine sample files. But that was about it. There were no windows to provide light, and he couldn't find a switch anywhere on the wall, but the footprints led into the room. He was standing on them, and he could feel the stickiness beneath his feet with every move he made. Then he noticed movement across the room, followed by the sound of something falling from one of the surrounding shelves. "Hello?" he said. Whoever was there had heard him, because they turned. He could see the slight glint of light in their eyes. "Are you okay?" It was the patient, the one that had been so unceremoniously detached from the drip in the adjoining room. He was obviously disoriented, and had somehow ended up in the medical supplies room, if the patient was still loaded with drugs, which Reynolds guessed would be the reason why he wasn't crying out in agony from the wound in his arm where the drip had once been fed. Then it would explain how he had accidentally confused the storage room for perhaps somewhere he could find help. "I don't think you're meant to be in here," Reynolds said. He pulled his baton out of its loop on his belt and clenched it tightly. He was taking no chances. For all he knew, the shadowy figure was one of the more violent prisoners in the facility, and hiding amongst the supplies while the alarm created a diversion had been part of his plan all along. There came an almighty roar from the patient, who had suddenly straightened up and, even in the dark, looked to be about 6 foot tall. Officer Reynolds didn't have time to scream as the patient lurched towards him, but the light from the adjoining room was enough to put a face to the growl. It was Tyler, one of the other guards, and now Tyler was tearing flesh away from Reynolds' ribcage. Finally Reynolds screamed, and he continued to scream until darkness enveloped him. They cowered in the cell, like two little boys hiding in the basement of their home as Daddy came looking for them for something naughty they had done. Only it wasn't Daddy they were afraid of. It was Cyrus Clay. Terry Lewis and Jared Cole had shared a cell for almost 7 years, and in that time they had discovered things about each other that not even their family knew about. It was one of the perils of living in such close quarters. You had no secrets. But Terry now knew that Jared could, if prompted, scream like a little girl, as he had when the cell door had suddenly unlocked itself. If Terry hadn't been there to cover his cellmate's wide-open mouth with his inhumanly large hand, there was no doubt Cyrus Clay would have heard the scream. Terry pulled the mattress off the bottom bunk of the bed just in time. The sound of the cell door next to them as it slammed open was a sign that Cyrus had managed to free himself, and now he would come looking. Terry yanked Jared into the corner of the cell, smashing his head on the aluminum toilet as he fell into it. He pulled the mattress against them, which acted as a makeshift hiding place that would probably fool nobody, yet it was better than nothing. Cyrus Clay appeared in front of their cell, his mouth oozing with black drool and his eyes darker than the deepest pits of hell. He turned momentarily towards the cell door, which, although unlocked, remained pulled across. Terry watched through the tiniest gap between the overturned mattress and the wall. Beside him, Jared was whimpering through Terry's fingers. A string of warm spit trickled across his knuckles. Cyrus Clay sniffed the air around the cell like some kind of wild animal. He grunted, and it was in that moment that Terry Lewis knew that what he was looking at was not human. At Sunday school, a young Terry Lewis had excelled to the point where a career in the clergy seemed to be the only option. He had prayed with the enthusiasm required to meet such exacting standards, and his parents had already pushed him into a few courses that would see him head into the field as a priest. He had, up until then, managed to stay out of trouble, and he had studied ferociously to placate his parents and meet the standards required by the church. He had learned all about the devil, and demons, and temptation, and betrayal, and had swallowed it all down heartily, yearning for more knowledge about the evil that men are capable of. A year later, Terry Lewis had been arrested for the murder of one of his teachers, a man by the name of Father Bennett. He had, in his own special way, become the evil that he had enjoyed reading about while preparing for priesthood, and yet the evil that he was staring at now, sniffing the air outside of the cell like a bear trying to figure out whether a log cabin contained anything of notability, well, that was something else entirely. If there was a hell, and Terry was pretty sure that there was, then Cyrus Clay's wearer had been sent from it to devour everything in its path. The creature turned to the cell and placed both hands on the bars. Terry Lewis began to pray silently. If Cyrus stepped into the cell, he would see the two prisoners cowering behind the mattress. Jared couldn't see what his cellmate could, but he could feel Terry tense up, which was almost as bad. "Hey, Cyrus," a voice said, and in that moment Terry knew that his prayers had been answered. The creature standing just outside the cell turned to where the voice came from. Terry couldn't see the man who had spoken, but he recognized the voice. Dale McCarthy. Cyrus Clay roared, and Terry watched as he stepped out of sight. Dale could be heard still. "What the fuck, dude? What's the matter with—" Then came the screams. Terry pulled his hand tighter against Jared's mouth. "If we're really quiet," he whispered, "he might go away." Jared nodded. "I hope so." Turning the bed around was the easy part. Making it fit the entire width of the cell, on the other hand, was impossible. "So long as most of the gate's covered," Billy said, "we should be okay." They decided not to leave the confines of the cell if there was going to be a riot. The chances are they would end up with more jail time added to their sentences, something that Shane was not willing to risk. Or worse, they could end up being killed. The best thing to do, both of them agreed, was to barricade themselves in. They had both been involved in riots over the years, and most of them had led up onto the roof, where there would be a violent standoff with the guards, leading to a list of menial demands which would never be met, since it was not prison policy to negotiate with the inmates, not under any circumstances. Billy picked up his table, which must have weighed a decent 100 pounds, and wedged it into the bottom bunk to prevent anyone from clambering across into the cell. Not that they would, of course. Not with a giant half-Indian, half-Irishman waiting on the inside. By the time an intruder managed to break in, they would have a size 22 shoe in their face. If they got as far as the bunk, Shane would be able to crack them across the head with something, perhaps Vonnegut. With the gate sufficiently blocked, they stepped back and admired their work. "Guards see this," Shane said, "and they'll realize that we're not taking part in anything." Billy nodded. "Let's just hope it doesn't last as long as the one last year," he said. "We'll starve to death." Shane laughed. "We won't starve to death," he said. "I promise, if anyone's going to starve, it'll be me first, and then you can just eat me." "I wouldn't eat you," Billy said. "No? I've smelt your insides on lots of occasions. Don't think it would be a good idea to go carving about and letting those gases escape." "Fuck you, Tonto," Shane sniggered. They sat on the edge of the bed and waited for things to calm down. The armory had not been breached by any of the crazed prisoners, which shouldn't have come as a surprise to either Jensen or Michelson, as a set of keys were required, not to mention fingerprint identification, which was scanned by a machine on the wall. Jensen held his hand up to the machine, but it took 3 attempts because of how badly he was trembling. When the light finally turned green, access granted, they both barged through the door at the same time. Inside, there were cages filled with guns. There were M16 standard military-issue rifles. There were a couple of Browning A5 semi-automatic shotguns. Jensen immediately unlocked the cage which held these and grabbed one. He'd had plenty of training with it, and had decided that it was his favorite of all the guns he had fired. Michelson was loading 2 Walther P99 pistols. If he was going into battle with something that wouldn't die easily, then he was going to do it in style. He fastened holsters to either side of his belt and slotted the pistols into them. "What the fuck are those things?" Jensen said, cocking his shotgun. "I mean, that thing wasn't thin as hard out there." He jabbed a conspiratorial finger towards the door. "There was no way he could have survived that fall. No fucking way. That was 40 feet. Maybe even more." "Keep your voice down," Michelson said as he concentrated on filling extra cartridges. "Whatever it wasn't death." "Did you see what it did to Dean?" Jensen added, his face contorted with disgust. "The way it tore at him like that?" "I saw it," Michelson said. He clipped 2 extra cartridges to his belt and began to browse the cages for more weaponry. "I saw it, and I'll never forget it for as long as I live. But for now, I want to make sure that I live for as long as possible." He unhooked some smoke grenades and fastened them to his belt, which was now looking more like U.S. Army webbing. "I hear you, man," Jensen said. "Do you think somebody's called for backup?" That was a good question. The alarm had been deactivated, though, which meant that any outside cavalry, had it been dispatched, would be returning to base, assuming that everything had been resolved. That was the way it worked. The alarm system was linked up to Jackson Police and the Army base over at Fort Neal. If the alarm had gone on for much longer, there would have been no doubt a helicopter would have been dispatched, maybe even a couple of armed response units. Trust fucking Charles Dean to send that maggot to shut the alarm down. Michelson grimaced, then shook his head. "We're on our own here, man," he said. "At least until we get to the radio." The radio was in Charles Dean's office, an old UHF number that could reach the Jackson Police and Fort Neal with the push of a button. Its usage had, over the years, been limited to 2 occasions, one of which had been a riot, the other a trio of escapees. "We need to get up there and call for help," Jensen said, brushing a hand through his hair, which was already greasy with sweat and worry. "We will," Michelson said. "If it's just the 2 of us, though, we need to watch each other's backs." "That's for fucking sure," said Jensen. He swung his shotgun across his shoulder. They grabbed up their ammo from the benches and left the armory. Dale McCarthy pushed himself up from the floor. For a moment he looked confused, staring this way and that, trying to figure out what was happening and where he was. His right leg was missing a lot of flesh, and the back of his neck, if he could see it, was stripped of meat to the point where his spine was visible. Only 3 fingers remained on his left hand, and 2 on his right. Somebody had gone to town on him, that was for sure, and yet he felt no pain. He glared down at his leg, at the hole that seemed to take up most of his left thigh, and it meant nothing to him. The missing fingers were not a problem either. What was a problem, however, was his hunger. It was the only feeling he had, a hunger so intense that he would do whatever it took to satiate it, if that was possible. He sniffed the air and he could smell them, hiding somewhere nearby. He drooled and groaned, not too loud, but loud enough for the concealed bodies to know that he was there and he was hungry. He could see further down the row, a figure lurching away, a man also in search of something to put an end to the painful hunger. Cyrus Clay stumbled through a gate and disappeared from sight, but Dale wasn't aware that it had been Cyrus, the man who had only a few moments before been feeding upon him. What he did know, though, was that he needed to follow the man on his search for food. The bodies that were hiding nearby were perhaps not there at all, but there would be others where the man was heading. He took a step forward and let out a roar. His leg didn't hurt like it should have. Everything for Dale McCarthy was fine, as long as he found something to eat. He took another step, and then something smashed into the back of his head. "Hit it again!" Jared cried. Terry Lewis lifted the makeshift bat, something he had been hiding in his cell for almost a month just in case, and slammed it down on Dale McCarthy's skull once again. There was a thud, like the sound of meat hitting the counter at the local butcher's. Dale was face down, but he was trying to turn himself over. His hands were grabbing out at anything they could get a hold of. Jared took a step back, not wanting to be caught by the flailing arms. "Fucking thing," Terry said. He lined himself up, then kicked the creature in the stomach. It lifted from the floor and came back down again with a sickening squelch. The black drool that had been dripping from the mouth of Cyrus Clay was now pouring from every hole in Dale McCarthy's face. Slamming the bat down, and this time connecting with the side of the creature's face, Terry felt liberated. Happy that he was finally using the bat he had forged to protect himself from scummy inmates. Instead, he was using it on a scummy demon, the kind which he was pretty sure he had studied at Bible class. "Watch its teeth," Jared called out, and he was just in time. The thing had managed to get up to one knee and was about to snap at Terry's leg. Terry stepped back and delivered a glancing blow to the face of what was formerly Dale McCarthy. The snapping teeth flew from its mouth, clattered against the rails of a cell a few doors down, and came to a stop like the roll of a dice on a casino craps table. Dark ooze spewed from the creature's mouth, and Jared almost felt sorry for it when it let out a moan, not of pain, but as an admission of defeat. Terry Lewis began to pray, not silently like he had done while they had cowered in the cell hiding from Cyrus Clay, but as loud as he could. "Most glorious Prince of the heavenly armies, Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in our battle against principalities and powers." Dale's skull split open as the bat came down again. Terry Lewis took a deep breath before continuing. "Against the rulers of this world of darkness, against the spirits of wickedness in the high places." He slammed the bat down. There came the sound of bones cracking. The creature slumped to the floor, growling and grunting, still snapping with whatever teeth remained. "Come to the assistance of men whom God has created to his likeness." "Fucking thing," Jared snapped, spitting on it and giving it a cautious kick in its backside. Terry lifted a hand and told his cellmate to take a step back, which he did. "And whom he has redeemed at a great price from the tyranny of the devil." He pulled the bat high into the air and drove it down with such force that it hit the concrete beneath the creature's face. The bat stood up, sticking out of the back of Dale McCarthy's head like a candle on a birthday cake. Both of the prisoners took a step back now. Terry's hands were shaking. "What was all that about?" Jared asked. "I didn't know you were a religious nut." Terry wiped the sweat from his brow. "I was," he said, "a long, long time ago." They watched as the creature continued to twitch for a few seconds and then stopped moving completely. "How many times?" Shane said to Billy, who was laughing. "I've never dressed as a woman. That's just your fantasy." "My fantasy," Billy said, "is to get out of here one day, track you down, and teach you how to fight like a man." "You've never seen me fight," Shane said. "Exactly," said Billy. "Which leads me to believe that you fight like a girl." Their banter was immediately silenced as something crashed against the cell door. Shane jumped to his feet, ready to hit anything that tried to penetrate their fortress. Billy backed up against the wall and reached into his boot. A small knife, although big enough to kill someone if you stuck it in the right place, came out. Shane offered Billy a silent glare. He wondered where Billy had managed to procure the weapon and why he needed it at all. Something slammed the cell door again, but neither of them could see who or what it was. The wedged furniture had worked so well that their view of the outside was compromised. "Get the fuck out of here!" Shane yelled, but he knew that whoever was hitting the gate was unlikely to listen. These were hardened criminals they were dealing with, not impertinent children. Telling them to back off was about as good as inviting them to try their luck at getting in. There came one more slam, a scream, and then a gargle so close that Shane could practically smell the breath of whoever had made such a noise. Through a crack between the cabinet and a chair, Shane could see skin color and a small rivulet of blood dripping across it. Then he was staring into the wide, bloodshot eye of a man as he slid down the cell door. "It's getting bad out there," Shane said, stepping away from the bed. A pool of blood began to work its way into the cell. When Billy Toombs saw it, he said, "No shit." The next hour was filled with screams, and Shane and Billy sat waiting, trying to figure out what was happening. They finally reached the conclusion all hell had broken loose. Marla was starting to feel the effects of the whiskey, and decided that she had had enough, despite it being a free bar. "Prick," she mumbled, referring to Charles Dean, and the ridiculous array of self-gratifying bullshit adorning his office walls. The thing was, it got boring after a while, and once Marla had read each of the certificates twice, she wanted to go home more than ever. She wiped the glass clean on the sleeve of her blouse and dropped it back into the fake globe, where it smashed against one of the miniatures at the bottom. She smiled, said, "Oops," and decided that it was a good thing that she would be leaving pretty soon as she could find another job. This really was taking the piss now. She had been stuck in the governor's office for well over an hour. What did he expect? Did he want her to wait there until he was good and ready to return? Was it possible that he had forgotten her, and was probably having a good old catch-up with the guards while they all smoked fine cigars outside? That, she guessed, was it. She wouldn't wait any longer. He couldn't fire her for going home. She was already fired, albeit amicably. Fuck it. She opened the office door and stepped out into the corridor. The light flickered on and off with an infinitesimal blinking sound every time it did so. Damp laundry-filled plastic baskets, waiting to be loaded into the machines which lined 3 out of the 4 walls. A few of the machines were still switched on. The red lights on the front of the consoles flashed. Whoever had used the room last had forgotten to shut down properly, which would, under normal circumstances, warrant a major bollocking from the guards, but in this instance it might be forgiven. "Shh," Terry said. Jared had accidentally tripped over a box of detergent, and was now standing in a pile of white powder, staring gingerly towards his reprimanding cellmate. "What if there's one of those things in here?" he asked, stepping out of the powder and leaving white footprints in his wake. "There isn't," Terry whispered. "How can you be sure?" Terry reached down and began to sort through a pile of folded clothes. "Can you see anyone?" "What are you doing?" Jared asked. Terry was naked now, apart from his boxers. "What the fuck does it look like?" he said. "I'm changing out of those." He pointed to the orange boiler suit, which he had just removed. "And I'm putting these on." In his hand he was clenching plain white clothes, a t-shirt and trousers. They were the official garb of the less violent prisoners, the ones from Block D, which was used to safeguard the pussies from the ones who might cause them damage. It wasn't fair, really, to throw in a tax evader with a serial killer. It might provide ammunition for the system haters who were already trying to initiate deals and retrials from the outside. "What about me?" Jared asked as he glanced down at his orange boiler suit, mouth agape. Terry shook his head. "Find your own fucking size," he said. "What am I, your mother?" Jared dropped to his knees and began to search through the pile. He was only small, and weighed less than 130 pounds wringing wet, but luckily so was somebody over in Block D. He quickly changed, shielding his inferior body from Terry Lewis, who was not interested in the slightest. Sharing a cell did not mean that you got to see each other's balls, and Jared was not the kind of guy to let it all hang out, not like some of the other inmates. "What the fuck are we going to do now?" Jared asked. The truth of it was, Terry had no idea. Something bad was happening, something evil. He had read all about it, studied it, but never once thought he would be caught up in the middle of it. "I don't know," he finally said, "but I'm not willing to die today, are you?" Jared shook his head. "Fuck no." "I want you to keep that at the front of your mind," Terry said, "and we'll get out of this just fine." Deep down, he didn't believe it himself. The main structure, everything up to and including Block D, had been built at a time when there was as much chance of breaking into prison as there was of busting out. In the late 18th century, a few people had succeeded in penetrating the security of similar-sized prisons, scaling the 20-foot walls, and getting retribution against inmates that had done them wrong, which was why Jackson had been created with that in mind. Surrounding the prison were 3 walls, each of which stood at almost 40 feet. Between wall 1 and 2, an electric mat covered the ground all of the way around. If anyone were to fall between these 2 walls, the chances of them surviving were minuscule, and if they did, they would find themselves wishing for death to come, just to be rid of the pain. Between the 2nd and 3rd walls, 8 men patrolled constantly. Out of the 8 guards, 4 had German shepherds. With the 8 dogs barking at each other, the 8 guards were gathered in one area between the walls, discussing why it was that they had not been relieved of their posts. A few of the anxious men argued that they needed to get home to their wives, for they would be worried. One of the men continued to attempt to get through on the 2-way, but, as had been the case for over an hour, there was nothing but silence. They decided to give it a few more minutes before sending a man in to investigate further. It was no wonder the prisoners detested Charles Dean so unequivocally. He had built himself a very nice quarters on the side of the prison. Everything, it seemed, was antique, or would be by the end of the decade. As a prison governor, he was certainly astute. But as a collector of fine arts, which would eventually fetch him a fortune at auction, he was as shrewd as any dealer. Marla wondered whether any of the prisoners had, at some time or another, made plans to relieve the governor of a few of his items. Probably. The problem was, though, that when a prisoner was escorted through to Charles Dean's office, usually by at least 2 guards, past all of the good stuff hanging on the walls and resting temptingly inside alcoves, it would be near impossible to cause a distraction large enough to sneak anything away, which made her wonder if any of the guards had had the same idea. She knew that Tyler was a corrupt fucker of a man, so it was likely, at some point, that he had been tempted by the goods on display, as he had been when he had assaulted Marla. She was sure that a man possessed of such weak will would find it almost impossible to ignore the antiquities and their obvious price tags. In fact, it wouldn't surprise her to discover that Officer Tyler had already embezzled a few minor items just to test the governor's knowledge of the items he actually possessed. It was simple, really. Start off small, work up to something worth enough money to retire on. Charles Dean was not getting any younger, and his memory was probably not as good as it had once been. Fuck. You could probably swipe half of the things lining the quarters, and he would be so caught up in prison business that he wouldn't notice until you were halfway across the country. Marla felt the effects of the whiskey as her head began to ache and buzz. She had to drive home yet, which was probably not such a good idea, but the sooner she got to bed and slept it off, the better. Noticing the eerie silence for the first time, she called out, "Hello?" It was, she knew, the worst thing to do. There was always the chance that somebody would reply, and being in a prison where hundreds of violent men were incarcerated and the guards were not much better, a reply was not necessarily a good thing. She ambled down the hallway, not knowing where she was going. This was the first time Charles Dean had taken her to his office since she accepted the position, and she couldn't remember which direction they had come from a few hours before, but why would she? She hadn't expected to be trying to find her own way out. She came to a T as she reached the end of the hallway. "Oh, great," she said, looking to the east and then the west. Decisions, decisions. But luckily for her, the decision was already made. From the east came a man dragging himself through the hallway, smearing blood against the cream wall. He was growling. His contorted face oozed with dark drool as he neared. Marla screamed. She began to backtrack, hoping that the office belonging to Charles Dean had a lock on the inside of the door. If it had, she hadn't noticed it earlier, but then she had been overwhelmed by the many egotistical certificates hanging on the walls. Why would she have been checking to see if the office had sufficient security? The man kept coming, sliding across the wall, leaving behind a trail of blood from a wounded shoulder. Never once, though, did he break into a run or quicken his pace. He was either confident of catching up to Marla or too wounded to run. Either way, Marla didn't care. She needed to call for help, and she needed to barricade herself in the governor's office. As she slid in through the door, she yelled up the hallway, "Stay away! Stay the fuck away!" The man didn't falter, just kept on coming. She swung the office door shut and looked down to the handle. There was nothing, not even a chain. Charles Dean certainly put a lot of faith in his guards, enough to warrant the lackadaisical approach to office security. The absence of even a deadbolt, though, was bad news. And Marla realized this as soon as there was a thud against the door. Her shoulder jarred from the impact as the man slammed into it again. She bit her tongue and blood began to dribble out in a fine rivulet. It hurt, but she didn't have time to acknowledge the pain as the man growled and pushed the door wide enough to slide a hand through. Marla screamed. Her instincts were telling her to bite the hand, but she couldn't. Looking down at it, she could see that it was basically an open wound. Knuckles were exposed, and sinewy flesh hung loosely from the thumb. A wrist followed the hand, and before she knew what was happening, the hand was smothering her face, trying to push her away from the door so that it could gain proper entry. Breathless and out of options, Marla knew that she had to step away. By letting the man fall into the office, she would be back on a level playing field. She knew what she had to do, and she knew where to find a weapon. She stepped away from the door, an exhalation, a whimper of fear. Had she made the right move? The door crashed open. The man's momentum saw him fall to his knees and sprawl out on the fancy rug beneath him. Marla had a few seconds, that was all, and she wasted none of them. She ran across to the governor's desk and plucked up the paperweight. She had spotted it earlier while sitting at the desk sipping whiskey. She abhorred it. The little boat at the center of the glass served to signify that Charles Dean was a prick. When she had sat staring at it, she had never envisioned using it as a weapon, but now that was exactly what she was going to do. She paced back to where the man was clambering to his feet. "What the fuck?" she cried. She hit the man on the side of the face with the paperweight, but not as hard as she should have. The man barely flinched. His eyes seemed to grow darker, and he was up on one foot before Marla managed to hit him again, this time with enough force to put him back down. "Fuck you!" she snapped. The man moaned, tried to crawl to his feet, but Marla wouldn't allow it. She hit him again. A chunk of the man's head came away from the force of the paperweight. Had she meant to hurt the maniac so fatally? Had she had a choice in the matter? He rolled over onto his back, and as he stared up at her with black eyes and a sneer, she brought the paperweight down once more. "How many of them are out there?" Billy Toombs asked. Shane, who was staring through a gap in the barricade, said, "Hard to tell. I can see 3 of them across the way." On the landing opposite, the 3 men were roaming up and down the row. Shane had watched the men leave their cells, watched them get attacked by other men, watched them die, and was now watching them as they wandered aimlessly around, bouncing off cells, crawling on all fours and eating the men who had lost the fight. The fear he felt when the realization of what he was witnessing had been immense, more than he had ever felt before. The last time he had felt so helpless and unsure was sitting in the car outside the liquor shop, waiting for the moment to make his move. "We need to get out of here," Billy said. The knife he had been holding throughout was still clenched tightly in his hand, so tightly that his knuckles were white. "It's only a matter of time before they find us. We're much safer out in the open." It was true. In the cell they had nowhere to run. 1, maybe 2 of them they could handle, but any more than that, and Shane knew they would be in serious trouble. "We go out there," Shane said, "then we'll need to go prepared. I saw what those things are capable of. They don't seem to feel pain in the way we would." Billy shrugged and began to look around the cell for something, anything, that they could use to protect themselves. He had his knife, that was enough for him, but Shane was unarmed. To venture out of the cell without at least something to keep those things at bay was practically suicide. Shane moved away from the bed, which was still blocking the cell door, and helped to search. "Where are the guards?" Billy asked. "Even the guards wouldn't have been able to stop those things," Shane replied. "The guards would have battered them a few times with their batons, but those fucking things are relentless." "You saying they're all dead?" asked Billy. He opened the drawer to his bedside table and started to remove the books that had taken up residence there, stacking them neatly on the floor next to the bed. "I'm saying it stands a chance that once the guards realized that they were fucked, they disappeared. The ones that were lucky did, anyway." Shane watched as Billy Toombs cleared the drawer of its contents and pulled the empty wood from its hole. There was an audible crunch as twisted metal snapped away from the wood. Satisfied, Billy tossed the empty drawer aside and pulled at the aluminum runner, which was still attached to the main structure of the cabinet. "You know," Shane said as his cellmate became increasingly frustrated with the recalcitrant drawer runner, "you really need to see somebody about that temper of yours." Billy smiled. His breathlessness prevented him from laughing out loud. With one final twist and a foreign word that Shane didn't think translated as anything nice, the aluminum runner came away. "Nice," Shane said. Billy handed it to him, and immediately it felt good in his hand. It was light, which was always good, and the end had twisted, creating a sharp point. It was, given the circumstances, the best they were going to muster. They moved the bed away from the gate, trying to keep the noise to an absolute minimum. Shane kept a close eye on the numbers outside the cell, and as far as he could see there were only 4 of them on the same level. The next level up, though, that one seemed to be swamped by them. Since there were only 10 steps between levels, it paid to stay as silent as possible. In another part of the prison, though, somebody screamed. It was faint, but both Shane and Billy heard it, and it sounded like a woman. With the bed pushed aside and their weapons in hand, Shane looked deep into Billy's eyes. And for the first time since they had met 3 years ago, the hulking half-Indian, half-Irishman looked frightened. "Ready?" Shane asked. Billy swallowed hard. "As I'm ever gonna be." Shane slid the gate across. At first, it didn't seem like the things noticed them. They managed to edge across the row quietly enough, and for a second Shane believed that they would make it all the way to the end and could slip away down past ablutions, and who knew from there? Then it saw them. One of the men on all fours across the landing, it peered through the middle railings, still on all fours, and let out a blood-curdling scream. The other three forgot what they were doing and turned to see what all of the fuss was about. "Oh, shit," Shane said, and that was when they decided that stealth had gone out of the window, and now it was time to put some distance between those things and themselves. "This way," Billy said, leading the way. Shane glanced across his shoulder to find that 2 of the 4 things were now following them. The one on all fours was too busy ferreting away in the carcass of some poor fuck, and the other had tripped over a body while attempting to make chase. "They're not so fast," Shane said. "We should be able to outrun them." Billy shook his head. "I've seen shit like this in films," he said, jumping over 2 bodies that were spread across the floor, blocking their way. Shane did the same. "You underestimate them, you die. Trust me." Shane did, implicitly. Sure enough, the 2 followers had gained some speed, and although they were on the opposite side of the opening, behind rails and a 20-foot drop, their sudden increase in speed served to make Shane keep his mouth shut in future. "What kind of films have you been watching?" Shane asked as they neared the corner. "You know, the ones where—" But that was as far as it got as a big, mean son of a bitch by the name of Xander Foreman slammed into him, sending them both to the middle flooring. Xander was snapping and biting at Billy Toombs, but Billy was having none of it. Even though he hadn't been expecting the sudden arrival of one of the creatures, he was now fully capable of taking it out. "Billy!" Shane called. He didn't know what to do, but hitting it around the face with his aluminum stick seemed to be all he could think of. "I'm okay," Billy said, not looking okay at all as the thing tried to take a bite out of his cheek. "Just keep an eye on those other 2. Shane turned. The other 2 were still coming and would reach them within a minute if they weren't careful. "Be quick," warned Shane. "We don't have all day here." Billy managed to roll over. The big man, although both of them were huge and it was like watching Godzilla fight Mechagodzilla, was underneath now. Those dark eyes staring up at Billy Toombs with vehement determination. Billy shifted his weight so that his elbow was across the throat of Xander, who choked beneath the weight of it. Billy leveled the knife and slowly pushed it into the creature's eye. There was an audible pop as the eyeball burst. Dark ooze squirted out and landed on the creature's cheek. Shane quickly assessed the position of the approaching creatures. They were within spitting distance. A few seconds maximum was all that remained before engagement. When Shane turned back, Billy was clambering to his feet, wiping the small blade on the sleeve of his overalls. The creature lay motionless. The tiny knife had been long enough to penetrate the socket and slice into the brain. "Shall we go now?" Shane asked, stepping away from the 2 creatures, who were clawing at the air and snapping with blackened teeth. "That would be nice," Billy grimaced. They turned and ran. Being at the end of the row had its drawbacks. For one, Rooster and Marvin had no clue that they were the only ones still in their cell. They simply couldn't see that everyone else had realized the doors were open, and the noises from the past 3 hours had been linked with the riot, not associated with the murderous assault of the hellish creatures as they swept across the prison. Yes, being on the end of the row certainly had its drawbacks. "It's all gone a bit quiet now," Marvin said, shuffling the cards so badly that Rooster wondered whether the man was developing some sort of disease. $50 says Harson's solitary. 50, Rooster said, shaking his head. How about 100? You're on, grinned Marvin. Easy money. Rooster was becoming bored of cards, but there seemed to be nothing else to do. Going to bed was not an option, not while there was a riot in progress. Going to sleep would be dangerous, especially if the guards were pissed off at the prisoners. See, that was the thing. If a riot was instigated, it wasn't just the minority who were punished, the ones who had plotted and started the uprising. It was everyone. To fall asleep now made you an easy target for the guards, who would no doubt be round very soon to cause some trouble of their own. You were likely to be woken with a steel toe-cap boot to the jaw, which was never a nice way to be roused. I wish we had a chessboard, Rooster sighed. I could play chess for fucking hours. That's a bit like drafts, isn't it? Marvin asked. The question made it pretty obvious to Rooster that having a chessboard would have been presently pointless, unless he somehow taught his cellmate the rules, which would have been like trying to teach a chimpanzee to sing opera. It's nothing like drafts, he finally replied. You trying to tell me you don't know how to play chess? Marvin nodded. Some of us didn't have chessboards growing up, he said. I had a penknife and a fishing rod. Rooster tried to imagine Marvin Murderer Manson as a child, innocent, heading off to the river with a box full of bait and excited expectations. It was perhaps such isolation that had led to Marvin becoming unhinged and killing 3 people in cold blood. Fishing was a dangerous sport if you couldn't cope with the tranquility and hours of tedious sitting. Marvin had developed his psychotic tendencies while eating a cucumber sandwich, listening to Inya from a crackly old radio sitting next to him on the bank. I used to play a lot, Rooster said. Too much, in fact. My sister could never understand why the bishops could move diagonally, and the little horse, that's what she used to call them, did that silly move that they did. I couldn't tell her why, but I just told her to play properly and stop being such a little brat. Rooster paused. The memory seemed to be more than he had expected, and the feeling that came with it he certainly hadn't anticipated. Dad took the board off of me after a while. He said that chess was for fucking pussies, and did I want to grow up to be a fag? My sister took to calling me a fag after that, and she and Dad would laugh about it. That's pretty fucked up, dude, Marvin said as he picked up dropped cards from the floor. I fucking hated them for that, Rooster continued. I stopped playing chess because I believed him. Can you believe that? I thought that my dad was right. Your dad sounds like an asshole to me, Marvin laughed. He was, Rooster said. Which is one of the reasons why I killed him. In hindsight, he smiled. I wished I'd shoved a few fucking nights up his shit pipe for the forensics to figure out. He burst out laughing. Probably a good thing we don't have a chessboard. Marvin sniggered. You're right. Rooster stood and stretched. His back made a terrible cracking sound which Marvin grimaced at. They had been playing cards for hours, that and listening to the riot play out. Now, though, everything had fallen ominously quiet. Rooster took a few steps towards the cell door. What would you be doing now if you weren't here? What, like if I hadn't been caught? Marvin asked with a slightly confused expression. Rooster nodded. Fuck knows. Maybe I'd still be killing. Maybe I would have settled down, got it all out of my system, and married some whore named Crystal. Rooster grinned. I like the sound of that, he said. Me, I'd probably just drive around the country, taking everything in. I've always wanted to do that, just hire a car and keep on driving. Marvin smiled tentatively. Wouldn't you have to return the car? Rooster shrugged. What would it matter, unless I got picked up by the pigs? That sounds awesome, dude, Marvin said as he stood from the table and stretched. His back, however, did not crack. Funny how shit works out, isn't it? Rooster whispered. Marvin didn't think it was funny at all, but nodded anyway. Rooster placed his hands on the bars of the cell, which rattled with instability. A sudden realization hit Rooster. Hell, when I asked what you would do if you weren't here, he said. Marvin nodded. Uh-huh. Well, how about we find out, he said, and with that he threw the cell doors wide open. Terry Lewis took a quick glance around the corner. There were 7 of them, 4 on the floor and 3 standing. The 4 on the floor were picking at the bones of something unrecognizable, while the others meandered around the corridor, confused, hungry. Terry made the signal of the cross against his chest. How many? Jared asked. He was half in, half out of the laundry room. 7, Terry whispered, "but we should be able to get by them without them noticing." The door which they needed to get to was a few feet away from the creatures. Terry knew that the ones feeding would be too busy to spot them as they passed, and if they were quick enough and waited until the others were facing the other way, they could make it without alerting any of them. "I don't want to," Jared said, fearful. His eyes were filled with tears. Terry realized that he didn't know his cellmate at all, not really. "Do you want to stay here?" asked Terry. "You want me to leave you to hide in there on your own?" Jared's eyes widened even more. His mouth fell open into a terrified O. "What if they see us?" he managed. "What if they see us, Terry, and we can't beat them?" Terry knew the consequences of such a predicament, but his faith had returned somewhat. Not completely, it wasn't the same as when he'd first discovered religion all those years ago, but when you were young you believed in anything. It was, however, enough for Terry to believe that God didn't want him to die, not yet. He had once been a training servant to the Lord. That had to count for something. "We don't have a choice," Terry said. "We need to get to the yard and pray that those things haven't had the same idea." "I trust you," Jared said, closing his mouth. Terry knew right then that he was not just surviving for himself. He had to take care of another soul, too. "I'm going to take another look," Terry said as he placed the flat of his hand against Jared's chest. "I'll wait until the coast is clear, but when I go, you go. There'll be no time to piss about. We head for the door, second up on the right, and we don't stop running until we reach it. Do you understand?" Jared nodded. "Good." Terry stuck his head out again. One of the creatures that had been standing was now feeding with the others, which meant that there were only two now who could possibly get to the door before them. Those two, though, were heading down the corridor, bumping into each other and bouncing off the walls like fleshy pinballs. "Now," Terry whispered and took off. Never once taking his eyes from the door, he listened to the creatures as they gnawed through bone and sucked at the flesh of the poor soul. It was enough to make vomit rise in his throat, but he quickly swallowed it down, never once faltering. He just hoped that Jared was following closely, for if he wasn't, then it would be too late for him to make it. One of the ambling creatures had turned and was now sliding along the corridor with teeth bared. It growled, but the 5 feeders didn't pay it any heed, even when it almost tripped over them and the cadaver upon which they fed. Terry reached the door and turned to find Jared had been less than a step behind him all the way. As he turned, they almost clashed heads. "Get in," Terry said, pulling the door open and forcing Jared through it. He followed, slamming the door shut as quickly as he could. There was a single lock halfway down the frame, which Terry slid into place. It would be enough to keep the creatures out for now. The sheet of glass which filled the upper half of the door would take some breaking too, and those things were weak. It would take a lot of them to push through the glass, and they didn't seem to possess the brain capacity to figure out a large brick or mop handle would be enough to break it. Terry wasn't taking any chances, though, and moved away from the glass. It was frosted, but that didn't mean the creatures wouldn't see them moving around on the other side. "The yard," Terry whispered, pointing across to the other side of the room, "is through there, out onto the corridor and 100 feet down. If there aren't any of those fucking things out there, we shouldn't have any problems." Jared took a step in the direction of the door. A hand yanked him backwards. He was face to face with Terry Lewis, who was holding his index finger up to his lips. "Shh," he said, pointing to the frosted door which they had just come through. There, standing on the other side of the door, was a creature, silhouetted through the glass. A hand came up and pressed against the door. Blood dripped down from the fingers. The light from the corridor made it a brighter red than it actually was. With its other hand, the creature was trying the door. The doorknob rattled slowly at first, then more urgently. Jared, Terry could see, was fighting the scream that so naturally wanted to emerge. The hand slapped, open-palmed against the glass, but there was no fear of it shattering. The creature moaned, tried the knob once again, and slowly moved away from the door. Light spilled back into the room from the corridor as the silhouette departed. They both exhaled. relieved that the creature had decided not to pursue them further or alert the others. Terry smiled smugly, which Jared didn't appreciate too much. "Let's go," Terry said, ushering his cellmate towards the door at the other side of the room. When they got there, Terry took a deep breath. Jared took a step back, and Terry grabbed the doorknob. He turned it. Nothing happened. The door was locked. Of course it would be, Terry surmised. It would have been too simple to just waltz all the way across to the yard with no obstacles. "I don't suppose you know how to pick locks?" Terry asked. "I was one of the best," Jared said. "Just give me a lock-picking set and I can get us in." There was more than a hint of sarcasm in his tone. Terry turned and began to survey the room in which they found themselves. Boxes, different sizes and multicolored, were stacked against the walls. It was some kind of file storage room, no doubt containing obsolete paperwork from years ago. "Wait here," Terry said. He made his way across the room, keeping a close eye on the glass of the door at the other end. He grabbed a box down from one of the shelves and took the lid off. As he suspected, there were folders dating back to a time when even he wasn't an inmate. All of the folders had names written on them in permanent marker, but none of that interested him. He opened one of the folders and saw what he was looking for almost immediately. He never thought touching a paperclip would make him feel so impossibly happy. He slipped it off the end of the papers that it held and dropped the folder back into the box. "What about one of these?" he whispered, holding the paperclip aloft as if it were the Holy Grail. "That'll do," Jared said. With the paperclip in hand, Jared went to work on the lock. Terry didn't know why, but he had placed his trust in a man who was clearly terrified of what was happening. Even as he watched as his cellmate trembled with the tiny piece of steel, he knew that if it came down to it, he would have to leave Jared behind. If it meant survival, then sacrificing Jared was hardly something that required much thought. Jared was likely to get them both killed with his current nervousness, and that was not going to happen, not to Terry Lewis, who had rediscovered his faith and expected God to make the decisions from here on in. There was a click within the doorknob. Jared retracted the clip and took a step back. "Give it a try," he said. Terry stepped up, placed his hand around the doorknob, and gave it a gentle twist. When the door pulled silently out of its frame, Terry felt bad for how he had been treating his supposed friend. "Well done," Terry whispered. "You did good." Jared smiled. "Thanks." They stood for a moment, breathing deeply, aware that anything could be on the opposite side of the door. Terry could feel the anxiety generated by both of them. The air around them was practically thick enough to run a blade through. It was like waiting for the impending apocalypse, like seeing the mushroom cloud off in the distance and knowing that you couldn't outrun it. "Wait here," Terry said. "I'll go take a look." Jared didn't argue. Marla turned the corner into another corridor and realized that she hadn't a clue where she was. The entire prison seemed to be made up of the same generic white corridors. The only way to determine where you were was to gauge the paint damage on the walls, which were peeling from years of neglect. She noticed that the heat was suddenly palpable, as if somebody had turned the AC off. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand. For a moment she felt like she was being watched, but that could have just been her mind playing tricks on her, which it was apt to do under the circumstances. What was happening? Why was she attacked? What had happened to Charles Dean and his merry band of guards? None of it made any sense. She had known, though, that something was going on when the sickness began to take hold of the infected. She was a good doctor, at least she thought she was, and would have been able to diagnose a simple fever without much ado, but the sudden temperature increase, almost 30 degrees in less than a few hours, and the strange, almost docile mannerisms of the infected, she couldn't explain that. It was beyond the realms of her comprehension. She slowly made her way up the corridor, passing by doors that were either locked or blocked by cleaning equipment. She was about to make a decision and try one of the doors when the man appeared from nowhere. Marla didn't scream, she couldn't. Her heart seemed to jump up into her mouth and prevent anything from emerging. "It's okay," the man said. "I'm not gonna hurt you." She was pretty sure that at some point during her life she had heard those exact words only to be fooled a few seconds later. She was taking no chances. In her hand she was clutching the paperweight, and now she lifted it into the air and began to shake it threateningly. "You stay back," she said. "I'll fucking kill you." She didn't know where her words came from, but they didn't betray what she thought she would do. "There's no need to be killing anyone," the man said, "so just calm down." Marla scanned the man, who was wearing white coveralls, which meant that he was non-violent for a concealed weapon, but if he was carrying one, it was extremely well hidden. "Who are you?" she gasped, swallowing hard. "My name's Terry," he said, offering a sweet smile. "Terry Lewis." Marla lowered the paperweight as if the knowing of his name made him less of a threat. She was about to speak, to ask questions that perhaps he knew the answer to, when another man appeared out of the door behind Terry. He was running towards her, his face contorted with violence, his voice attempting something of a scream. Marla recoiled, raised the paperweight once again, and waited for the man to reach her. He didn't. As the man was level with Terry Lewis, Terry threw out an arm which hit the new man in the throat. He crumpled to the ground, where he began to roll around, clutching at himself where the fist had connected. "Never mind him," Terry said, as calm and collected as was possible. "He tends to get a little nervous around women that aren't his mama." Marla relaxed a little. "I don't suppose you know what the fuck is happening here?" she asked. "Haven't a clue," Terry shrugged. "But we're staying alive as best we can." To Marla, that sounded like a good plan. They encountered at least 15 of the creatures as they ran across the landing. At one point, it looked as if they were cornered, but managed to weave and push the things away without getting snagged or scratched. It wasn't a good idea to hang around any longer than was necessary, and so they kept moving, trying to stay one step ahead of the thickening throng of wandering bodies. Shane developed a stitch in his right side. He hadn't been working out as often as he should have recently. What was the point? He was a free man in a few weeks, and he knew that once he was home with his wife and daughter, visiting the gym would be the farthest thing from his mind. Now, though, as the pain stabbed at his ribs, he wished he'd at least stuck to some sort of regime. "How you doing?" Billy asked, noticing Shane's hand gripping at the pain in his side. "You haven't been scratched, have you?" Shane laughed, slowing his pace. "Hell no," he said. "You know when I stopped going to the workout room a few weeks ago?" Billy nodded. "It was a bad idea," Shane said. "I feel like I'm going to keel over any second." Billy stopped running. There were no creatures about, not at the moment. "You need to get some water down you," he said. "We should get to the canteen." The canteen was downstairs. Who knew how many of those things they would pass along the way? But it made sense. Shane was thirsty. "Sounds good to me," he said. "You never know. The survivors could all have had the same idea. Go to where the food and water is?" Billy hoped not. He wasn't really in the mood for socializing, especially with a bunch of people who were either infected or deserved to be. They continued, knowing that the likelihood of the canteen being open when they arrived was slim. Yet they had to go somewhere. Standing around waiting for the creatures to find them was not an option. Shane hadn't noticed before, but the prison was filled with the sounds of the undead, scratching around, moaning and growling. He thought that if he listened hard enough, he could hear them chewing away at captured inmates, but that might have just been a figment of his imagination. Along the way, Billy started a conversation that seemed to lead nowhere. Was help on its way? Shane said that he didn't think so. Billy tended to agree. If news of what was happening had reached the outside, then the cavalry would have already arrived, wouldn't they? Billy said that the cavalry might have been notified, only to deem the prison and its inmates as collateral damage. The government was known for its lack of compassion when it came down to the greater good, and Shane wouldn't have put it past them to ignore any pleas from within the prison if it meant the issue being contained. A few floors above them a scream echoed. It sounded like a man's, but it was difficult to tell. Billy and Shane shared a telling expression before descending the steps to the floor below. It was here that they found the man. "Did you know him?" Shane asked, glancing down at the mutilated body lying vertically on the final few steps. Billy shook his head. Me neither," Shane said through gritted teeth. "Whatever did this to him was fucking persistent. I'll give them that." The body was missing a leg and an arm. Most of the right-hand side of the torso had been gnawed through. Exposed ribs jutted out at uncompromising angles. The face on one side was stripped clean to the skull, and both of the eyes had been removed, leaving only the darkness of the sockets in which they once sat. "Sick fucking things," Billy said, holding a hand up to his mouth, anticipating the vomit that never quite arrived. The dryness of the mouth, though, proved how close he actually was to throwing up. Shane stepped over the extended leg of the prone body and almost slipped in the blood that had pooled around the cadaver's ankle. Billy grabbed for him and managed to keep him upright. "You okay?" asked Billy. "Nearly went arse over." The corpse suddenly snapped into life, grasping Shane's ankle. At first Shane didn't know what had happened, and stared into Billy's eyes as if his colleague could explain further. Billy pulled Shane away from the body. The hand slipped off Shane's foot and thudded down onto the third step of the stairs. What made everything 1,000 times creepier, though, was those eyes, or the lack thereof. The corpse snapped its head around, trying to settle on something